Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Red Hour on the Midwestern Marx live stream. We have a trio of Midwestern Marxists for you here today. Here with Carlos and Noah, going to break down some of the current events, news and politics going on, talk about China, talk about Russia, Ukraine, as we have been lately, maybe get into some theoretical topics. So, yeah, it should be fun. I'm happy to be here with these guys. Much more fun. Streaming with a group, so and it's not super rare but not super common that we get all three of us together, so whenever we can, it's a great time. So we'll get right into it after our intro. All right, how's it going, guys?
Good, very good. It was a long week, but the weekend's finally here, so that's good for me.
For sure. How about you, Carlos? You just finished your research paper, right?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I finished yesterday, and today was the refinement day, and was able to get that done, so it feels really good. I'm just waiting for like one more article to come in from the interlibrary loan system because so much shit that I need is behind paywalls. But once that's in and I'm able to cite the thing that I found in there, I'll be good to submit it, and then I'll be chilling for the next 3 or so months, just focusing on the institute work, and that's it. I'm excited for it. I needed the break.
For sure, I bet. I've been there. I'm glad to hear it, though. So, yeah, the first thing we want to talk about is the anti-socialist travel advisory bill in Florida. I know people are quick to use the word fascism, sometimes too quick to use that word, but in this case, this is sort of a drift towards fascism that Florida is going towards. And, some of these higher level classes that they've shut down, classes teaching Black history and African history, rooting that kind of stuff out of the education system, and then putting in writing, a real bill saying we will not accept socialism here. We will not accept certain political ideologies. And we know the first thing that fascists always do is crack down on the socialists and the communists, who are the first ones to resist the rise of fascism. So this actually affected our friend Comrade Libre, who was protesting recently and was arrested, now is being charged with misdemeanor charges for literally protesting and singing a song, non-violently protesting, and singing a song with a group demanding a meeting with Ron DeSantis, who said no, and then had the cops arrest them. And this anti-socialist travel advisory was actually put out by Rick Scott, the governor, but him and DeSantis are really a deadly duo there in Florida. Two of the most heinous right-wing politicians that we have. So, yeah, what's your guys' first reaction to that?
Well, the first thing it makes me think about is why now? And it reminds me of when the McCarthyite era began, and learning that history. It began because the working class was beginning to radicalize. The communists were getting through to people, and the ruling class was terrified of that. And so they did whatever they could to stop that happening. And that's what this seems like to me. There's multiple layers to it. And it has a bit of an effect on education, like Eddie was just saying, and just general social unrest. But I want to focus on the education bit first because that happened a while ago, and continues going on. They sort of couched this in opposition to this new sort of academic theory called critical race theory, right? And criticisms of bourgeois theories aside, whatever. What they've done with it is, under the banner of being against critical race theory, attacked all education about Black history and the history of slavery and the history of the struggle against this in the state. And so it's a really insidious thing that works on multiple levels. It's just beyond messed up. And that also carries over into this new thing where he's talking about, socialists shouldn't come to Florida because it was off of an NAACP statement. And again, the NAACP, criticisms aside, was basically trying to say that Florida is not safe for Black people because of this, right? And all sorts of marginalized people. And so, yeah, I mean, we'll get into what was said and all that, but I think it's very telling how these work in tandem with each other, as well as all the misinformation wrapped up in all of it. But yeah, we'll get into all of it.
It's interesting that the NAACP called it out in terms of racism and bigotry because, what are the twin weapons of capitalism, imperialism, and fascism, as Henry Winston would say? They're racism and anti-communism, right? You can genuinely be against the struggle against racism if you hold on to anti-communist positions, and the other way around as well. So what's interesting is that I don't have a lot of experimental knowledge in the parts of Florida that are not South Florida, and there's this sort of running joke of people that have lived in South Florida, which is that it's basically its own state. But I do have to pass by Central and Northern Florida in my drives, and you see the Confederate flags, and you see this very entrenched legacy of slavery, the Confederacy, Jim Crow. You see it and you feel it. Sometimes even more than in the other southern states that are archetypically what come to mind when you think of Southern racism. But you mentioned, Noah. You asked the question, why now? And that's such a good question because one of the things that we know as Marxists is that every development in fascism, which is really just capitalism showing its other face, is done at a moment where the conditions for socialism begin to arise. There's this old statement from Walter Benjamin, which is that every rise of fascism is a failed socialist revolution, which means that the soil that can breed socialism is the same one that breeds fascism. And that's what we're seeing in Florida. And what's not reported by mainstream media and other medias is the immense transformations that are occurring, especially in young people in Florida. And South Florida has been the hub of anti-communism because for many years that's where the bourgeois and petty bourgeois diaspora of socialist countries in Latin America that had their revolutions, that's where they all fled, right? Started with the Cubans, but then with the Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, etc. So South Florida is a good litmus test for what the most backward or reactionary parts of the country are. And what I've seen over the last few years in South Florida has been just a tremendous transformation in the people's consciousness, especially younger people. In 2020, the demographic of 18 to, I want to say 27, 28-year-olds or 35-year-olds, I think it's 18 to 35. In that demographic, they voted overwhelmingly for Bernie. And I know Bernie's, of course, not a Marxist or anything, but that's telling. It's a candidate that's positioning himself, calling himself a socialist, and that got the largest vote in young people in one of the areas of the country that's supposed to be the most anti-socialist and anti-communist. I've seen it in my own experience when I go back there and I engage with the people from the local DSA, from other organizations like Troika, people that are doing amazing work with the Cuban caravan down there that's done every month. It's headed by this group called Puentes de Amor, Bridges of Love, that's trying to phrase the activism to lift the blockade in terms of, these are our brothers and sisters. Let's build a bridge of love instead of a wall of hate. And those caravans keep getting larger and larger and larger, while the protesters against them keep getting smaller. And as they're getting smaller, they keep getting more violent. They've punched Libre, who was the comrade of ours that just got arrested. They've hit cars, and so there's a transformation undergoing, especially in young people in Florida, and they realize it. It's very easy for that transformation to occur when they look at their future and they see a futureless future. Like, they're not going to be able to have anywhere near as decent lives as their parents had or their grandparents. And that material condition has opened up a lot of young people in South Florida and in other parts of Florida, I imagine, to the ideas of socialism, and that the existing order is messed up. So I think that what we're watching is a reaction of the fact that conditions have changed materially, and therefore they've changed subjectively, specifically in younger people.
I think too, there's a story that you used to tell people in the Bernie campaign when we were working for Bernie and knocking on doors and stuff, because they had you basically say how you came to socialism or how you came to Bernie or whatever, but what made you support universal health care. And Carlos had this story about his experience with the healthcare system in the U.S. that I think really, really describes why a lot of young people in Florida and even Miami, are starting to sort of lose the anti-communist character that the older generations have. I think you should tell that story, Carlos, if you want to.
Yeah,
That's a good idea.
My mom. What was that, Noah?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was saying that's a good idea. You should tell that story again, because it's so symbolic of so many people. I have a similar story, and I think it's also a very good way to explain how it isn't, convincing everybody that communism is the way forward that convinces people. It is the inability of the working people to continue on in the old way.
Yeah.
Right. And
think
that's a
most
perfect
people-
example of it. I mean, we're supposed to have a right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in this country. And we don't have any of those three.
Right. And I think most people, like you said, have stories like this, if not related to healthcare, which I think a good portion of them are, related to other things. And, in philosophy, sometimes this has been called an event, a sort of thing that happens that shatters the everydayness, the sort of quotidianness of your everyday life, of your life world. And it forces you to think about the logic that's imbued in how your life is. And that's what happened to me. My mom had my little sister. She developed these fibromes within her. The doctors told her, if you don't get these operated, you might die. And so she was forced to make the calculus of, do I get this operated and put my whole family in debt for the rest of their lives and my lives? Or do I just roll with it and roll the dice and see if I survive? She rolled with it. And thankfully, everything so far has been fine. Nothing bad has happened. But I was around 10, 11 years old at the time. All I heard from my parents' friends and family was that Cuba was the worst thing ever. It was a totalitarian hellhole that was just poverty and just the most obscene, horrible place to be. But these same people, when my mom was faced with that decision, told her, "You should go to Cuba and get the operation." And that really, really puzzled me, because we're talking about the richest country on the planet, and the people that have been, just flouting how rich this country is, how good it is. And they're telling my mother to go to a very small and very poor country that they had nothing to say about except for very negative and horrific things. And why was that? And that's a problematic that lingered with me for a very long time. And Bernie Sanders came around, explained the role of private insurance companies and the role of the for-profit system in medicine, and it helped me make sense of that. But You know, a lot of those same people that hold very deeply anti-communist ideas, that are very anti-Cuba, when they get hit, my wife's neighbor ended up developing diabetes, and he developed it very badly. In order to get the insulin, he had to go to Cuba. So he would make very frequent trips to Cuba, and he's literally, you know, he was literally being saved by Cuban medicine that he had to get, even though he was from a country that has a surplus and he couldn't get a hold of it because he didn't have the insurance wouldn't cover it fully, and he was poor. And somehow, still, the place that's giving him the ability to continue surviving, he still considers it to be this totalitarian hellhole. You know, but these contradictions, uh, at some point they come out into the open and people can see them clearly, right? It's kind of like when you're looking for something in the fridge and it's right in your face, but you can't find it. Eventually, you're going to get to seeing it, right? You're going to adjust your eyesight. Something's going to happen. You're going to look at things from a different angle, and you're going to be like, "Oh, there's the Diet Coke I was looking for," or something. And that's going to happen to a whole lot of people, especially younger people that don't have these prejudices that have been ingrained on a lot of the people in South Florida that are deeply anti-communist. And even them, they're overcoming it. You know, I know people from my wife's family. They've been born and bred on anti-communism, but they're massive. They turned into massive Bernie supporters. And every time I talk to them about China, about Cuba, about communism in general, they're fully on board. And if there was, you know, a communist party in that area, I'm sure I can get them to join it. You know, so the material conditions have changed, and that has allowed a openness in the people's thinking that I think we should be there to explore and help redirect them into the correct positions.
Yeah, I just want to add on to that really quickly that as that anti communism fades, the ruling class isn't stupid, right? They have to give us something that isn't a genuine revolutionary way forward. So the tactics are shifting because that overt anti communism is no longer working for young people. What they do is use the words communism, socialism, Marxism, etc., but give us just more liberalism, give us just more bourgeois ideology. And so it's important that we educate ourselves. Don't trust these bourgeois institutions. This is what I get, right? Don't trust these bourgeois institutions to tell us what time it is. We can get our own goddamn watch and we can look for ourselves.
True. Yeah, I just want to point out too that the accusation against Cuba is that they're authoritarian, which, you know, maybe they're forcing healthcare upon their people and you consider that authoritarian, but the
Those
reason
horrible totalitarians make me read.
the reason insulin is so expensive is because of the intellectual property regime that's enforced by the pharmaceutical companies, pretty much not allowing any generics or any cheap kind of medicine to be produced because they have the patent on this. And as I wrote about in the Journal of American Socialist Studies too, the World Health Organization was basically formed so that they could enforce that globally on a global scale. So, you know, what is more authoritarian than, you know, making government bodies to make sure that nobody gets medicine, you know, them to make sure that the profit incentive of multi-billion shareholders who are worth billions of dollars, making or prioritizing their profit over bringing medicine to people in the third world or people even here in the US where 40,000 people die every year because they can't afford healthcare. They don't have access to the health insurance that they need. So there's no system more authoritarian than neoliberal capitalism, where capital is concentrated at the top to the degree it has in every industry, including healthcare, which is a huge portion of the American economy at this point. They make so much money selling us healthcare because we get sick from the processed food and garbage that they sell us on the other end. But
well, what's more authoritarian than preventing the history of slavery and the fight against racism from being taught in schools? That's literally erasing the past. And that's erasing our primary form of class struggle through a giant period of American history, right? And the withholding, to switch to another vein real quick, withholding the means to life from people and extorting money out of them for it is more authoritarian than any like wartime policy the Soviet Union had.
And that's necessary to capitalism's function. Otherwise, people don't have to sell their labor for a wage.
Right. And people need to risk their lives, like Carlos's mom, or sometimes die or go into bankruptcy and millions of dollars in debt like my family did, you know?
There's like
we had millions.
There's like 60% of people that are prevented from buying a home because of medical debt in this country. And there's still 40 to 60,000 people dying because they're either underinsured or uninsured in the country. And that's just completely absurd. But to point at something that Bill Bradley here said, which I think falls well in line with what Noah was pointing at, academia is full of professors pushing the Frankfurt School and its derivatives and selling it as socialism. It leads people to say things like real socialism has never been tried. They believe a lie. And that's absolutely why it's so essential, the project of, attacking this controlled counter-hegemonic left, attacking the radical recuperators, because people are getting mobilized. People are getting radicalized by their objective material conditions. And if the people that meet them there in order to take them to what they consider to be radicalism are these radical recuperators, the Zizeks, the Frankfurt schools, the Judith Butlers, and all this different post-colonialism, postmodernism, post-Marxism, post-humanism, if they find those people instead of us, they're only going to end up falling into a fold that's deeply pessimistic, that doesn't actually oppose the existing order, that actually is fundamental for the functioning of the existing order and for the ideological legitimation of the existing order, especially in times of crisis when the war drums come out and they're pushing for war with whatever country. These people are the ones that defend those wars from the so-called left. And when you're trying to organize a population that has been indoctrinated by anti-socialist, anti-communist rhetoric, the first thing you need to do is break the myth that socialism has never worked. And the myth that socialism has never been tried is just the left-wing pseudo-Marxist version of that conservative argument that socialism has never worked. And you have to break that. And without breaking that, you can't actually present to people an alternative order. They end up just falling into nihilism, which is what a lot of these people want, because explicitly their conclusions land them in pessimism and nihilism, or in finding some revolutionary subject that's like 1% of the population or something, and will never lead to substantially challenging the existing order. So it's fundamental to challenge these this controlled form of counter-hegemony, these thinkers that participate in what Lukács called indirect apologetics by seeming somewhat critical of the existing order, but more critical of any other alternative, that being, of course, socialism.
Well, it's, first of all, if you're looking for a different revolutionary subject than the proletariat, then you're just completely ignoring Marxism altogether, first of all. But to go back to what, was it Bill Bradley, I think his name was, said, I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been writing about it a lot. And there seems to be two general outcomes, right? And it's got a class divide along it. So within the proletariat, it generally just turns people off from what they see as the left altogether. And I've been writing about this recently. We have less of a right in our country among the working class than we do an anti-fake left. They see this fake left, they're completely alienated by it, as they rightly should be, and go the other way to other people who hate those people. And the other one is more along the professionals, the remnants of the middle class, and even some of the reproletariat that see this and have either the comfort or whatever to go and fight for what they believe is a moral cause. And what this does is it keeps this left a professional or PMC left. And it keeps that sort of class hegemonic within it, or did, until this period right now, where people like us are really gaining steam. And if you notice, the people who, hate the Midwestern Marx Institute and other working class communist organizations and institutions, they're all part of that fake left. And they're sort of worried that we're overtaking them. And again, as they rightly should be, we are overtaking them, and we are coming to take the thing that they believe they own, which is ownership over being revolutionary in the US, right? Because we actually are, and we're interested in getting things done.
Yeah, before we get any farther away from the topic of Cuba, I just want to hit some of these super chats. Thank you, Alicia Chaffin. Tomorrow is the anniversary of the first military engagement of the Cuban Revolution when the guerrilla forces beat the Cuban army at El Uvero on 5/28/1957. Very cool. Yeah, thank you so much for the $5. Cool little history fact there.
And the Cuban Revolution is such an amazing example of the fact that the most important thing in having is the people, right? As soon as they land, they have the vast majority of their troops divided, a bunch of people killed, and they end up with like 13 people. But they had the people's pulse. Like they were able to organize a campesinado, so the agrarian farmers and workers. They were able to organize the working class in the cities. They had connections to the union movement. So if you have the people, you have everything. If you don't have the people, you have nothing.
Yeah, the communists at the time were actually calling Che an adventurist. And they were like, no, the people aren't ready for revolution. But they were all living in Havana. Most of the communists were in the universities. Similar kind of situation to us today, honestly. And Che said, no, the people are ready. And obviously he was correct. And obviously the communists supported the revolution once it looked like it was going to succeed. But
that's what's kind of weird about there's an argument that people make that Che was an adventurist, and Bolivia is a good example of him outstretching the capabilities and the potential of the material conditions. But I don't know if that's necessarily true, because they could have just, imagine planning out what they did in Cuba beforehand. You would have probably thought they were crazy to think that they would succeed. The odds of him succeeding in Bolivia were probably as likely as him succeeding in Cuba. So, we should criticize adventurism, but sometimes it might end up working and producing things like the Cuban Revolution, which had you said it was going to turn out like that, they would have called you an adventurous nut beforehand.
I think it's fair to say he probably didn't understand the material conditions well enough in the Congo. I don't know as much about Bolivia, but definitely the Congo before he went, because he just didn't have that same connection with the people. And obviously he was an Argentinian, so he had to learn, or the people of Cuba had to learn to embrace him and stuff. And he had to show them that he was trustworthy, but he understood Latin America really well. And obviously Cuba's in the Caribbean, but I don't know. I think it was a similar culture and similar conditions across Latin America, but in the Congo, it was, ended up being kind of a disaster. Obviously, Bolivia kind of was too, but yeah, it could have gone the other way too. You never know. I would just want to hit this last super chat. Thank you, AJ, for that. Well, we can answer this question unless you guys have anything else to add about the Che thing.
I just have one more thing to add about the Cuban Communist Party at the time. It just, again, there's a parallel to us here, right? People that are in more comfortable environments have a tendency to more easily believe the lies of the enemy class, right? So when they say the people will never go for it, they're just used to that. So they go, of course, the people aren't ready for revolution. They're the same kind of people telling us these things today. Like, oh no, the people won't support communists. You're crazy. Just try to do harm reduction with the Democrats or whatever. But the people are ready. And the people every day I talk to people about this stuff. People are ready and sick of the way things are going. And they need something new.
Absolutely. And before we, because I don't know if we've been still in the segment of the socialism in Florida, the anti-socialist bills in Florida, but I think it's important to put it in the context of what's been going on at the national level. And this was a bill from a resolution from, I believe, last year, or
Oh,
was it this year? Um,
Carlos, do you want to get to the super chat before we do that?
yeah, but I'm trying to phrase this as somewhat connected to the
Oh, okay.
first.
My bad. My bad.
Um, we had the horrors of socialism
Mm.
resolution pass. I believe it was earlier this year, maybe late last year. The months are blending into each other,
We
but it's
talked
at,
about it when it happened.
yeah, we covered it when it happened. But it's at the same time as the vote, um, uh, this vote right here, no, this one. This was a vote against the glorification of Nazism, combating the glorification of Nazism and neo-Nazism, and 62 countries voted against it, including the U.S., which is, along with Israel and Ukraine, one of the countries that consistently votes against it. So um, where it's not just Florida, right? The things we've seen in Florida are kind of a microcosm of other tendencies that we've seen in the nation as a whole, which is not just a cracking down on socialism, on the legacies of struggles in our country and around the world, but also an acceptance of a space for fascism, open fascism, as we see. You know, you can glorify, the U.S. is okay with the glorification of Nazism, but it passes in the same year a resolution against combat, a resolution to promote the horrors of socialism. And if you're in Florida, you can get persecuted. If you're a socialist, you can get arrested, as our friend Comrade Libre just recently was. If you're a teacher or a student, you have to say what your political affiliations are. So it's a turn towards fascism. That's, yes, in part in the Republican Party, but you also see it in the Democratic Party, because fascism is not this weird thing that just pops in out of nowhere. It's something that's embedded in the structure of capitalism itself, and it arises. It shows itself. It's the other face of capitalism that comes out in these moments of crisis. And the way that the bourgeoisie needs to move forward is through the open dictatorship of the most reactionary segments of finance capital.
Speaking of Florida, in Florida specifically, the Democratic Party is calling the Republican Party socialists. Like they toss the word back and forth.
Yeah, that's right.
It's wild, especially in like Miami-Dade, where there's
Yeah,
a lot of rich houses and real estate, that kind of stuff. But yeah,
right.
it's
They've been calling Trump a communist and
right.
comparing him with Fidel.
Oh my god. Yeah. So does anyone have any advice on how to unionize in southern states? Obviously, it's going to be tough in Florida, based on what we just said. But it depends on the workplace. You got to be very careful because they are just allowed to fire you pretty much for trying to unionize. So my advice would be do it in secret. Meet with your coworkers in secret. Make sure that you guys are careful. Make sure that it's people you trust. Don't just bring anybody in on it. But you can kind of gauge like the level of class consciousness in the workplace, and especially amongst individual workers, like and target the ones who will be on your side with something like that right away. People who are discontented with the situation, who are more class conscious. That would be my advice. But yeah, a lot of it depends on the workplace. And I mean, the state laws are terrible everywhere for unionization. Right? Most states are right to work states, and they can pretty much just fire you for unionizing, like I said. But yeah, that'd be my advice.
And just remember that the conditions, the material conditions that have led you to think about organizing your coworkers are the same ones that your coworkers share, because they're your coworkers, right? So their material life has a very high degree of commonality with yours, and their difficulties are similar to yours. So um, I would say that don't be scared from the point of view of talking to them about it, because I think that overwhelmingly they'll be able to connect with you and agree with you. The tactical side of things is going to have to come in, as Eddie said, in terms of not letting management or the owners know what you're doing, being able to do it underground and in a somewhat secret fashion outside of the workplace, meeting in bars or whatever you're doing. But in terms of approaching your workers, I think that if the conditions you're in as a worker for that specific company have led you to think that you want to unionize, your coworkers are probably there with you.
And depending on the type of job you have, sometimes like who are the snitches, right? That's very important, especially in a more dangerous state like Florida. Only talk to people you trust at first until you have at least half your shop or office or warehouse or whatever it is. After that, you can afford to be a little more out in the open. But a lot of times, floating flyers around can help. If you can take management knowing something's happening, as long as they don't know who it is, then I would suggest something like that because it'll let you sort of take the pulse of the people around you without, letting the snitches know who's who yet. Another thing is see if other places like that in your area have unions. Talk to more powerful organizations. The laborers unionize a lot of different people. The Teamsters have unionized all kinds of people in the past. Just see who's around. A lot of times, even just contacting the unions and asking one of their outside organizers, that's sort of someone that works for the union that goes and tries to get non-union shops to sign up, right? So talk to one of their outside organizers and just ask them for logistics advice.
Yeah, that's good advice. So thank you very much, AJ. Good question too. Also, thank you to Ashley Herbert for the $5 super sticker. Really appreciate that. And also thank you to Yacon East. Eddie, when are you going to grow a nice beard like Carlos and Noah? Love y'all's work. Keep it up. Thank you so much for the $10. I'll grow a beard like that when I can. This is about as good as I can do right now.
You can be our goatee man, brother.
There you go. I don't like the goatee too much though. It gets too long and just looks greasy.
RBN had a goatee though. I mean, he wore that goatee.
RBN did a thumbnail this week and I had a goatee and I thought I looked terrible. I was like, oh man, they did me dirty with that one.
Blonde hair sometimes just don't work with that,
True. Right.
You gotta dye it red. Grow it out, dye it red, style it nicely. And it's about oil. People undermine how much beard oil or the other foam, how much it works. But
and by the way, if you have a wife or a girlfriend, they dig the beard oil because otherwise, like having your beard smell like sandalwood all the time is a good thing. Just saying.
As opposed to like buffalo chicken sandwiches or something.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like if I dye my goatee red, people will mistake me for Jason on Ruhe.
I don't think anyone could ever do that.
He's got the red mohawk going on.
That guy's quite a character, man. Quite a character.
He is. I watched a debate of his yesterday. It was had me rolling.
I'd imagine. He
So let's talk about. We've been talking about.
Can I interrupt you, buddy?
No.
Oh, all right.
I'm just kidding.
Having gone through your entire debate with Vish, whew, man, 2.5 hours on my own was hard. It was all the respect in the world for how easy you make that look, brother. For real.
Well, thank you. Maybe that's what I needed, like a nap today. I got done and then I went and lifted and all of a sudden I was like, I'm exhausted. But like when I do these streams, it's like I feed off your guys' energy. And sometimes I feel like it gets that way with the chat when I'm doing it by myself. Like that's my favorite part is just like pulling up people's comments and going rapid fire. But yeah, it ain't easy. I'll say that. Hassan, obviously we have our criticisms of his son, but respect to him. He does like 6 to 8 hours a day, or at least when he was coming up. Like the dude just is a machine.
Mad respect for that. It is harder than people think.
Oh yeah, because you have to be really high energy if you're going to keep people entertained nonstop. Even the video game streams are difficult, like keeping high energy and interacting while playing the game.
Speaking of which, we got to start playing Fallout soon. My son has been asking me when Eddie's going to come play Fallout with us.
Oh, sweet. Yeah, we got to do it then. I'll download that next. I'm almost done with the Final Fantasy game, and I'm kind of getting bored of it. So, yeah.
Eddie, Noah, do you wanna answer Born Magician's question?
You want me to go first? Okay. It's 50 years into the future. The Midwestern Marx Institute is in power. What was your place in the global revolution? Well, I don't think the Institute itself would be in power. It'd be the Communist Party and the people, right?
No, us.
We would be the new Mount Rushmore, right? The three of us.
I don't want to even get like 10-foot. I don't want to touch power with a 10-foot pole. I want you guys to lock me in a room somewhere in Italy with a nice view, a nice window, some good coffee, good pastries, and just leave me there to do like work on Hegel, Greek philosophy, and that's it. You guys get it done, and just leave me to be a hermit reading philosophy and writing. And when you need an army,
that's me. Look, I fight because I have to fight. When I fight physically, it's because I have to. If you're asking what I want to do, I want to be in a classroom. I want to be teaching new people. I want to be helping young revolutionaries come into their own and seeing like the next Lenin as they come of age and begin learning and watching the sort of, there's nothing better for me than watching someone begin to get it clicking, right? That like moment when they're like, oh, it's all contradictions. It's just like, that hits me right in the inspiration, keeps me going, that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
Eddie would lead the American Bolsheviks. Hell yeah.
There you go. There's my role, I guess.
100%. And I'm not joking. I would follow this man into a revolution any day.
It'll all start when I double leg Henry Kissinger, which has to be soon because he's probably going to pass away soon. But yeah, since we were talking about the socialism ban and Democrats and Republicans distorting what socialism means, do you guys want to jump into this short animated video from the Mises Institute, which is a libertarian think tank? What is socialism? I haven't seen the video yet, but if it comes from the Mises Institute, you can only assume that it's genius, high level, intellectually honest stuff. So,
absolutely. Thank you, Max, but I don't think we can put that up.
Yeah, let's definitely cannot pull that up. But thank you for the super chat, Max, and interesting to know, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you, Battle Cossack, for the super chat as well. Was Nikita Khrushchev a good leader of the USSR? I guess we can touch on that first.
It's an interesting question.
It's kidding. He's better than any U.S. president, except for maybe Lincoln. But the secret speech was filled with riddled with lies, and really set the global communist movement back, and Khrushchev largely led to the Sino-Soviet split, which was really devastating for the global communist movement. And obviously, China is still socialist, whereas the USSR collapsed. So history has shown who was right in there in that split, but in my opinion. But he did good things. Some of his foreign policy was good. Obviously they were still trying to build socialism at that time, so there was a lot more done for the workers than anything that was going on in the U.S. But
I feel like Khrushchev's a very complicated figure. Overall, I would give him, how the Chinese talk about Stalin being 70 good, 30 bad. I would say Khrushchev is 70 bad, 30 good, right? So yes, he did the secret speech. It was all wrong, but he was also placed in this absolutely impossible situation. How can you follow Joseph Stalin? You cannot, especially after how they built him up during the war. Um, there had to be some sort of centralization of power around a figure. It was a bad decision, but they were locked in, and so they had to destroy that power around a figure somehow. The way they did it was horrible, and China studied this like crazy. By the way, there's a really good pamphlet they did called "On the Question of Stalin." Um, but at the same time, he's the guy that stood up at the UN, pounded his shoe on the table, and said, "Your children will be communists. You're welcome." That's awesome. Objectively, just awesome. He made fun of Nixon while debating him. All kinds of great stuff. Then you get to détente. Détente's a very weird thing, right? Peaceful coexistence and competition with capitalism. Sounds great in theory, right? But the way it works, how could you be so naive as to really think the imperialists are just going to let socialism grow? You can't. However, he was facing nuclear weapons. So there's that. I think that barreled down to his view of the threat of nuclear war versus Mao's. Mao called BS on the whole thing. However, Mao also believed that if the world got nuked, it would be okay. Socialism would come out on top. It would be a smaller world, but it would be a better world. So there is some bad stuff over there too. When the Sino-Soviet split happens, I actually side with the Soviets, despite their bad leadership.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think it might be a bit rough on Khrushchev. I'd give him maybe a 50-50 or a 60-40 because the détente, I mean, just think about it in our context. We're fighting for peace so much, and we do realize that insofar as capitalist imperialism is sustained, there's no such thing as like stable, peaceful camps. Like, we're not dumb. Like, we know that multipolarity is objectively good, but that insofar as capitalism continues, as Lenin, showed indisputably, it's going to rise in another moment into more tensions, and we know that, but we're still fighting for peace today, and for peaceful competition, and for the ability to engage in international trade through win-win relations. And that doesn't take away from the fact that we know that's not going to be likely, but we still have to fight for it. And I think that's kind of the position that Khrushchev was in, and his efforts to cool down uh, the very scary, potentially nuclear war era that he governed in. I think we have to give him a little bit more credit for that. Uh, of course, the secret speech is horrific. It's perhaps the most uh, influential thing in setting back the international communist movement, the global communist movement, and it's undeniable. Just look at the numbers of like party membership. I think they drop around like 40% around the world. So it's horrific, and I think both the Sino-Soviet split that comes out of it, each country ends up weakening itself out of it. Like no one came out of that positively. But also, we have to realize that some of those structures that allowed someone like Khrushchev to come about and allowed someone like Gorbachev to come about afterwards were flawed, and they should have been changed. And Stalin was trying to change that, and he was prevented from changing that by some of the old guards. The old guards prevented the efforts in democratization that he was attempting to bring out, which would have allowed people that were actually committed to the revolution to come to power, and not certain people that were, not uncommitted, but also had certain careerist, more individualistic aspirations conjoined with their socialism, and or people that were just unprepared, like Khrushchev was just letting pretty much anyone in the party in a very willy-nilly fashion
Well,
without
this
having theoretical preparation, and that's something that like the the Soviet course and the manuals, all of that were attempts to combat that. That in some ways were successful, in other ways weren't. But I think we should defend Khrushchev around the imperialist, around communists. We should, perhaps be a little bit, perhaps no, we should be more critical of him than we are of someone like Stalin.
I think Carlos, you just brought up a brilliant point. When it really gets down to the problems during the Khrushchev era, and you hear a lot of weird ultra-left sort of narratives about how Khrushchev started the return to capitalism, and that's not the case, right? What happened was they began slacking on Marxism, on the education, and Stalin tried to fix this. The short course was actually a compromise. What Stalin's original plan was a highly intensive political and ideological education course for every single party official. And Khrushchev was actually one of the main people within the secretariat fighting against this and letting people in, like Carlos was saying, willy-nilly in his oblast when he was at that level. Now, when you think about that in a historical sense, over the course of the 50s and into the 60s, this is what creates the new generation, right? And the people who were going into power in Gorbachev's era, right? Without that brilliance of Lenin and Stalin and the very dedicated learning they had to do to change society, it was slacking on the part of leadership on education. It's not like they weren't communists. They were. They were just not educated, I guess. I don't know.
All right.
I just posted, just real quick, I just posted an article from Grover Furr that was published on the Journal of Labor and Society. That it's a peer-reviewed journal, like or high-standing academic journal, and it goes over Stalin's efforts at democratization and the pushback from some of the old guards, and how embedded in that and in plots to overthrow the Soviet Union is where the what's called the purges come about. So it's a really good article and it's short. So if anyone wants to check that out, and it's a scholarly source, peer-reviewed journal.
Yeah, I was going to say when I first learned about that, I was kind of surprised. I'm like, oh, it was the opposite. You hear that, Stalin was the dictator, and maybe in the West, Khrushchev was a little better. But then you learn that actually Stalin had these plans for democratization, and, the bureaucracy kind of got too big, and power was a little too centralized under Khrushchev, which is the opposite of the way it's told. It's inverted through the lens of corporate media or bourgeois media. So thank you for that, Kyle Pettis.
The Chinese... I'm sorry.
What? No, go ahead.
There was a point related to this, so if you're going somewhere else, then I'll give it. But
I was just going to hit our super chats.
Okay. Just real quick, the Chinese have... they've developed... they've studied the fall of the Soviet Union closer than anyone, and they give three primary reasons: historical, organizational, and ideological. Historical, they ground that in historical nihilism, the process of de-Stalinization that was started by Khrushchev. Organizational, they ground that in the fact that anyone was being led into the party. In China, right now, if you want to become a party member, it takes like 2 years of vetting and tests and missions that you have to accomplish for the people.
Xi himself famously failed his first couple attempts to get into the party.
Right.
And he had a doctorate in Marxism-Leninism.
And
Doctorate.
And political and ideological, which is just the ability that the party was structured in such a way that something like Gorbachev couldn't be prevented, even though there was definitely people that tried. There was coup attempts, and it couldn't work out just because of how, unfortunately, top-down the party was. And it worked for a specific era when it was crafted, but it was sustained past when perhaps it should have been. And those are the things that Stalin was fighting against. So the Chinese very much agree with this line of thinking that comes from this book, Socialism Betrayed, by Roger Kenney and what's the other
Roger
guy's
Kieran and
Roger Cleary.
and Kenny. Oh God, because Kenny's not his real name.
Yeah, it's a
Is
pseudonym.
it Ed Kenny? I think he
I don't
uses.
think so. But anyways, it's a book, Socialism Betrayed. It's a great book, but it says that you have the roots of Khrushchev in Bukharin, and when the Bukharin line comes to power with Khrushchev, that line on leads to Gorbachev. So the downhill spiral starts with Khrushchev, and the Chinese generally agree with this assessment from this book.
For sure.
We got
Thank you,
another.
Lemonheads. Lenin is bald and beautiful. Bald is base. True. Afghanistan or Iran? Are you asking which one I like more or which one we prefer? Maybe that's in reference to Khrushchev's foreign policy that I was talking about earlier. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like this is such a controversial thing to say in the West, but what the Soviets were doing in Afghanistan was trying to help. They were trying to stabilize things and allow a socialist democratic government to come about. And, even non-communists who were there at the time, like witness reports, like the U.S. was, destabilizing us, funding the Mujahideen, arming up Osama bin Laden's rebel groups, whereas the Soviets were helping us like build hospitals and stuff. It was just pretty obvious that the two armies were there for different reasons. But of course, the U.S. justified everything they were doing by using the Soviets as a boogeyman. Very similar situation to Russia, Ukraine, honestly, but I mean, less devastating and less full scale. Because like I said, the Soviets were just acting as a stabilizing force there. They weren't fighting a war against the Afghan government.
The Afghani had begged them to intervene, and they kept telling them no. And oh God, I'm spacing on the detail I was just remembering. Whatever. I apologize. I forget it. It fell out of my brain. But yeah, there came a certain point. Something happened, and they were finally like, "Okay, we'll go help." And this was precisely what Brzezinski's CIA wanted them to do. The U.S.'s plan in funding the Mujahideen was to, quote, give the USSR its Vietnam, meaning put its military in a foreign country that it cannot leave. And that's exactly what happened. Now, they were there aiding the revolutionary government rather than the U.S. and Vietnam over there trying to mass murder people for profit. It's a big difference, but that's what happened. And this is a really, really important era because it begins the era of the media war being primary. The war was happening, yes. People were being murdered. This is horrible. The primary tactical situation, however, was the propaganda effort. Whoever could frame things their way on the international stage would be the winner. And it ended up being the U.S., unfortunately.
And I think that's a lesson that they learned from Vietnam, because people make this point in like communication studies. Like Vietnam was the first war that was really televised, where most Americans had televisions in their homes at that point, and there were camera crews that could show the devastation that was happening firsthand. So people were getting in their living room broadcast news of the napalm and Agent Orange and the destruction, and hearing news of all these civilian casualties. And after that, we learned about this, or I learned about this from Dr. Dar, a professor that Carlos and I had, who actually writes for our website now. But after Vietnam, they really clamped down on what the media is allowed to film in terms of U.S. war zones. You're basically escorted now by a member of the Pentagon or the U.S. military or the State Department or whatever, and they make sure that you don't film anything that's going to be harmful to the U.S. propaganda narrative. So for the war in Iraq, the Gulf War, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, as it's called, the propaganda was highly controlled, and all the combat zones were highly controlled in terms of what you could film. And that wasn't the case with Vietnam. Yeah. Could you explain the relationship of Stalin to American communists, anti-communists claim the CPUSA were Soviet stooges? I mean, they were just like everybody in the world pretty much just looked to the Soviets. I mean, they were the leaders of the global communist movement. And the CPUSA trying to create a communist movement in the face of McCarthyism, and wage class struggle in the face of McCarthyism and anti-communism here in the heart of the empire. They were heavily reliant on the Soviets and just looked to them for advice and strategy. And yeah.
I really think actually this is one of the main criticisms I have of our entire movement is we were now it comes about naturally because of sort of the American pragmatic social consciousness, but we never developed our own theory, our own movement. There were so many pros for taking direct leadership from the Soviets and just following whatever the Soviets said, which is what we did. Funding from the KGB. That's gigantic, right? Millions upon millions of dollars being used to help our class struggle. But at the same time, it allowed our theory to stagnate, and we weren't able to develop in our own particularity with our own conditions, driving our own revolutionary thinkers and leaders. We should have been, developing out of Du Bois, who was really teaching everyone in the party anyway. But we weren't. We were following the Soviets. And then what happened when the secret speech happened? Everything fell to pieces because suddenly our leader, who could do no wrong, who we listened to the point of silliness sometimes, honestly, as much as I love our party, that's what happened. Suddenly that leader was persona non grata. And the best our American leaders could say was, oh, Stalin's a question for the Soviet people, not us, right? Which is a cop-out. And I don't know. I apologize. I had something else, but it's gone.
Right, and I think part of what allowed the Chinese to succeed is that their class struggle was much more intensified than ours. They had like whole zones that were conquered by the Communist Party. We never had that, but they realized very quickly that unfortunately, but it was the case that sometimes the international interests of the Soviet Union would not align with the national interests of the communist struggle in China. And, there was a lot of tension there very, very early on. And eventually the Chinese ended up taking their own route. And of course, this is well before the Sino-Soviet split. This is in the Stalin era. And you see some of the leaders around this time of the Chinese Revolution, the people that were a part of the New Culture movement and, founded the party afterwards. They would put out articles that were very, very critical of Stalin. And, I think one of the central reasons why the Comintern ends up being dissolved, besides being, a gesture to the West, is in many ways it was a system that was guiding policies of communist movements around the world from a place that didn't have as concrete a knowledge as those people had. And, the Chinese weren't the only ones that their national interest for their class struggle and what was desired for the international interests of the Soviet Union did not fully align. So, I think we do need something like a communist international today, but it's going to have to function in a more democratic manner than it did with the Comintern. Great as though it was, and I've heard older comrades in the party describe the relationship that our party had to the Soviet Union as like the party here was the snake body, and the Soviet Union was the head. And when the Soviet Union gets overthrown, it's a snake without a head. In many ways, you see the influence that some of these bourgeois rad lib theories have in certain parts of the party, and you can't help but think that in part that idea that there was really a retarding of the theoretical development of the party because of the dependence on Soviets for their thinking. it it played a role in the trajectory of the party. Besides all the other bad stuff, the attacks from the State Department and just these horrific things that were wrought on the party, but yeah, and that's why I think that the project, that the institute that we have is so important, because it doesn't lose sight of practice. We realize that practice is fundamental, but um, we're bringing back the idea that theory is important, and that's been something that's been gone for a very long time in militant and organizer spaces in the West, and specifically in the U.S. Theory has been seen as this, vague thing that the academics do, and then practice is this thing that you just pick up your signs and you go to the protest and you scream out some chants and that's it. And neither of those are really doing anything, right? The practice is blind, and the theory is empty. And the point is to conjoin theory and practice so that the one is not blind and the other is not empty. And that's what we're trying to do.
For sure. Thank you, Tria, for becoming a YouTube member. Really appreciate that. Thank you to our boy Pennis Strager. Appreciate the discussion. Cheers, comrade. Thank you, Pennis, for your continued support and for your
having the best name on the internet.
Yep. I consider Kim Il-sung as the best among socialist leaders. I'm starting to study the Juche idea. Yeah, Kim Il-sung was awesome. Derek Ford told us in our podcast with him about Korea that there were actually battalions who were dispatched by the South Korean fascists backed by the U.S. just to hunt down Kim Il-sung and kill him, because he was such an effective organizer, political educator, military leader, all of the above. So the idea that Syngman Rhee was the democratically elected or supported leader and Kim Il-sung was not is hilariously stupid. And that's literally the idea pushed by the U.S., even though the only reason that the U.S. had to invade in Korea was because nobody would support Syngman Rhee. He couldn't find any soldiers to fight for him who wouldn't just run away right away because they were just paid mercenaries or whatever, versus the entire country supported Kim Il-sung. So that's when the U.S. had to go in and kill 20% of the population with bombs in order to prop up a fascist dictatorship in the South. So, yeah, Kim Il-sung not only helped lead his country in an independence struggle against the Japanese, but then immediately, similar to Vietnam, was immediately invaded after that by the U.S., who tried to snatch that colony up and paid an incredible price. It's almost incomparable to anything in history. It is comparable to Vietnam, probably, with the amount of devastation that was wrought on their infrastructure and, their agriculture and their industry by the bombing campaign. So making, what would have been an easier transition to socialism into it, there was nothing left. And then what does the U.S. do after they destroy the industry is they put them under an embargo. So there's nothing left there to produce anything. It's all been bombed, and then they're not allowed to trade. They're being strangled. But Kim Il-sung had so much support among the people, and the idea of independence and socialism had so much support that they maintained their sovereignty, and they're still a socialist society to this day. And to this day, they're the only country in the world who is not allowed to be a part of the IMF and the World Bank. So completely locked out from the financial system. And that's not just because of them being ultras. They have requested to get into the IMF and World Bank, and they've been denied every time by the Western world and the finance capitalists. So I know North Korea, some people think they're, even a lot of communists still think they're crazy and believe a lot of the media lies about them. But it's like the more successful you are in building socialism, the more BS the bourgeois media piles on you. So that's the deal with North Korea. They've been so successful in defending themselves and have thwarted the U.S. at every turn and remained socialist through all that. So the U.S. just piles propaganda on them. The U.S. hates North Korea. They can't stand that they've been unable to break these people and break this socialist project. So, yeah, and a lot of that could be traced back to Kim Il-sung, which is only, Kim Il-sung, this all happened in the early 1950s. Right. So people think it's insane that there's this political dynasty and that people have so much affiliation for the Kim family. But it's like, look at their history and look how recent that was. Look how we hold up figures like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And, we would say rightfully so. imagine if that happened 70 years ago and one person in every family of 5 had been killed by some invading country, and there was a leader who led us against them and led us to independence. Would we not have affiliation for them and their children? Of course we would. Plus, the Kims are voted into power also.
There's also
Beautifully
the
said.
fact that every one of them, Kim Jong Il and Kim Jong Un, have split the powers of the offices, right? So Kim Il Sung was president for life, or I forget the name of it, and it had all these powers. Kim Jong Il comes to power and splits those in half between 2 different offices. Kim Jong Un comes to power. That's now 4 offices, and he only fills one of them. So it's really spreading it out among more people. So the idea that they're consolidating power is just not the case.
Right. And, one of the things that I love seeing on YouTube is these travel vlogs, whether it's to China or the DPRK. And it's so hard for people to understand that that's true. You see these things, these comments like, "Oh, you're just paid by the government," and it's not true, and that's how propagandized the people are. But look at these travel vlogs. Look at how comfortable and stress free some of these people's lives are in North Korea, and it's yeah, sure, maybe they don't have as many metropolitan luxuries as we have here. But how many regular working people can afford those? How many parts of the country, rural parts, are even close to, the New York cities and the Chicago's and the Miami's and the Houston's and, so, and it's not like, similar style places like Pyongyang is absolutely beautiful. There's so much to do there, and there's so much like stress-free life. Like stress is such a big component of the American working class's everyday life. Stress about debt, stress about paying bills, stress about work, stress about overwork, stress about a million things, about your kids getting a good education, your kids' debt. There's so much stress all over the place. You don't have that in the DPRK, where people own their homes at like 90 something percent rates, which is the same thing in Cuba, the same thing in China, the same thing in every other socialist country. Where you don't have people that are going in debt because they got sick or because they wanted to get an education, where all of that is free. And after you finish your work day, that's less than what most Americans work, you can go learn how to play the violin or the piano, or go to the movie theaters, or go play billiards without having to decide, hey, I've saved up for 2 months, can I get a violin class or something? So it's a completely different type of society. And in terms of what we were just talking about in the last segment about the inability of the Communist Party in the U.S. to develop its own form of Marxism, the opposite has been true in Korea and in the unoccupied, uncolonized Korea, because that's what the South Korea is. It's colonized Korea, but the opposite has been true there, where they've developed, the socialism, Marxism, with their own civilizational characteristics, and it's absolutely beautiful. And although it's not the sort of thing you can copy and paste here, I don't think we should like adhere to Juche here, because it's such a uniquely Korean thing. From studying it, we can learn how it is that you approach the method of synthesizing Marxism, Leninism with a unique tradition of the civilization that your people are embedded in. So there's so much to learn and so much to uphold of our Korean comrades, and full support to them. They've been under the most stringent sanctions and blockades over the last 70 years, along with Cuba. And if there was a lighthouse of hope for humanity when the Soviet Union was overthrown, it was the comrades in Korea and Cuba that were, guiding the way while we were in an ocean of darkness. And they guided the way forward. And now we're here. Now we have, again, a big part of the world that's moving towards socialism. Multipolarity is on the horizon. And I don't think, had Cuba and the DPRK fallen along with the other parts of the socialist camp, I don't think it's likely that something like what we have now would have arisen as quick as it did.
I think it's a good to point out too that they continued guiding the world, even though that the fall of the Soviet Union devastated them, because that's who they were trading with. They were under these embargoes, and the Soviet Union was giving them extremely favorable trade policies. Now, obviously, Korea wouldn't have been able to do this without China right there, so that's a factor too. But like Cuba was, the Soviet Union was buying all their sugar, and similar stuff with the DPRK. So after the Soviet Union falls, I think it's known as the Arduous March in North Korea, and then the Special Period in Cuba, where basically their people know that we're going to have to, our living standard is going to decrease, our material conditions are going to get worse, but, you know, are we still going to struggle collectively for socialism? And the answer in both situations was yes. And now, you know, they've been able to establish food sovereignty and things like that, and, you know, create a higher standard of living for their people, despite the embargoes that they're under. And those are the two most crippling U.S. embargoes on the planet Earth. The one that's on the DPRK, which is only matched by the embargo on Cuba, which somehow they're ratcheting up every year. I don't know how. They're probably just recalibrating it and making sure that there's no trade getting in or out. But yeah, it's crazy that those countries have been able to survive. So I want to hit this. Lemonheads, can you guys have a discussion with Carl Zah? I would love to. That'll be someone I can reach out to on Twitter here soon. So Noah, I know it's getting late for you. Do you guys want to get into this Mises Institute, What is Socialism video? I want to make sure we hit it while we still got Noah with us.
Let's do it, brother. And I just drank like 3 cups of coffee. I'm good.
You're rearing to go? All right, I like it.
He's gonna have a heart attack at some point in the night. Wake up without a Noah.
I got my mug here and my thermos.
At least we'll have this highlight, but tomorrow we'll start preparing funeral.
Yeah, it'll be worth it for the highlight.
Yes.
So this is from the Mises Institute, like I said, libertarian think tank named after Ludwig von Mises. I think he's considered an Austrian economist, but I just call him one of the neoclassical economists, anti-Marxist, bourgeois economists. And they like to pump out a lot of nonsense. So we haven't seen this video yet, but I'm sure it's intellectually honest and, you know, features some really genius level thinking and economic theory. So yeah, that was sarcasm.
What is socialism? Economics studies human action using economics.
Stop already.
And how
No, economics isn't. That is the vaguest, most confused sentence I've heard in a very long time. Economics studies human action. That mixes up the universe. It pretends that there's this particular thing that is a universal. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm already getting upset.
No, it allows them by saying, and that you'll hear that in almost every neoclassical economics class, and that's them setting up the utility theory of value, which is their theory that, you know, the market just figures everything out because it gives power to the consumers, you know, supply and demand. So we just have to leave companies alone and then, you know, give consumers all the power. So that's what they say is, you know, the analysis of markets, the analysis of supply and demand curves, which is what they base everything on, just comes from human action and humans' decision to purchase things or not. That's where the demand curve comes from.
That's sort of the basis of Mises's, was it praxeology, he called it? He tries to study individual human action as such, which is the dumbest thing because that doesn't exist. All action is informed by what creates it, you know?
Right.
And then creates something else, and it's all...
Right, and you can't like they'll use the demand and supply curves to determine things like price that are quantitative, even though you can't quantify demand. So it's an unfalsifiable theory. So yeah, modern economics is stupid. Read my article on neoclassical economics and postmodernism.
social systems create different results based on how they allocate resources. With a market economy, production is guided by enterprises seeking profit and
Pause again. It's not just based on how they allocate resources. That stems from the relations of production, right? Which I guess you can say the means of production are resources which exist in the hands of the capitalists. But that's where like accumulation stems from. The fact that the workers are exploited working for the bosses. So the more surplus the boss, the more the boss can drive the workers' wages down, the more surplus they can make. and the more that they can accumulate, which is just distribution towards the top. But it's not just distribution and resource allocation. It stems from the relations of production at the core of the system.
Well, and already it's making this dichotomy between a market and planning as two separate social systems, and that's not what happens, right? There have been markets since the advent of property itself, really. And there were markets in feudalism, there were markets in industrial capitalism, there are markets sort of in our modern financial capitalism, there are markets in socialism in every socialist country there's ever been. So the idea that profits and innovation are guiding these markets, one, isn't always the case, and two, isn't a qualifying feature. So basically what they're saying here is nothing.
Right, and the false dichotomy that he provides, I cite it in my book on the purity fetish and in other articles I've done on China, just to critique the Western left, because the Western left accepts this dichotomy. You either have a market economy or you have a planned economy. China has markets, therefore China's not socialist, because socialism means full-scale planned economy. And that's just untrue, because markets, they've existed always, as Noah mentioned. Marx writes about pre-capitalist markets in Volume 3 of Capital and other places, theories of surplus value, sections in the Grundrisse. And, what you find is that markets as a form of engaging in distribution end up working in accordance with the form of production that grounds the distribution. So the moment of production is like the ground, the backdrop for then the moment of distributions. And if there's markets in the moment of distributions, those are going to function in accordance with what the mode of production is. They're called by Roland Bohr and other Chinese scholars a universal institutional form that can only exist insofar as it can concretize through particular economic systems. And that means that markets always function differently. They function differently in feudalism, in capitalism, and they'll function differently as they are functioning differently in socialism.
I like to think of it as the sphere of the sphere of production is the base, the relations of production are the base, and the sphere of circulation kind of grows out of that, develops out of that. And that's how Marx frames Capital. Capital Volume 1 focuses on production. Capital Volume 2 then focuses on the circulation that stems from that. And it comes back to production in Volume 3.
And then in Volume 3 extends past that a bit too. But what I wanted to focus on is what they're doing when they sort of put it in terms of this dichotomy is confusing form for essence, right? We've seen Soviet planning, their version of it that arose from their particular material history, right? And so if it isn't the Soviet Union's particular form of planning, then it isn't planning, right? But there are a million forms of planning that happen in all kinds of different situations. The U.S. economy is very, very, very planned. It is not run by a competitive market at all. It's run by financial institutions, and the commodities that are being sold are the underlying basis of that. But all of the markets are also planned. So just like in China, the socialist markets are planned. What is invested in is planned. It's just done differently and in different class interests.
And innovation. With cronyism, government influences market outcomes with intervention. A command economy rejects markets entirely in favor of central planning. This is socialism. Under socialism, central planners control what is made, who makes it, and who benefits. While markets reward those who best serve customers, socialists promise that everyone's needs.
None of this is true.
How do they control who benefits? How do you control who benefits from the use value of a commodity? That's
How
just
do they control what is made? Do they think like Soviet central planners were just like, let's make a bunch of jumpsuits today. You know what I mean? Like, no.
And here's
That
what I
word-
mean. So really quick, here's what I mean by they're setting up the utility theory of value, that customers, decide everything. Well, markets reward the best, or who serves the customers the best. It's all based on that demand theory, as if everybody can afford everything that they want or that they demand under capitalism. Go ahead, Carlos.
That word cronyism always pisses me off because it supposes that there's a non-cronyist, capitalism. And capitalism, the natural tendency in its form of competition is monopolization. And, the natural tendency once it gets to a certain stage of development is to revolutionize the state. And of course, you have the bourgeois revolutions in the 18th and 19th century that create the capitalist state. So the government has always been involved in proliferating, and sustaining the existing capitalist order. So to imagine that there's this capitalism without government interference, without big monopolies, influencing the market, it's just completely absurd. And already in Adam Smith's writings, his main concern with the disturbing of the free market was not like labor unions or the government interfering so that people can have basic services. His main concern was the way that monopolies have tended to develop, collaborate with one another in order to then influence the markets for their own good, which is profit. And he saw that good as in many instances contrary to the common good of the people, and he shitted on capitalists for their for their attacks of labor unions and worker combinations when they themselves are constantly in combination with each other to continue accumulating capital. So it's completely absurd.
It's funny because when he uses the term invisible hand, he seems to be doing so condescendingly, as if capitalists are guided by a sense of an invisible hand and sense of noblesse oblige, or just wanting to do the right thing. And he's saying that this is what we're trusting him for. But a lot of the time, libertarians today, by the way, will pretend that they agree with Adam Smith while having no idea what he actually said. But what they'll say is that, well, right now what we have is this crony capitalism, and there's never been a monopoly without the government. To which I always sort of go, wait a minute. There's never been a corporation without the government. There's never been money without the government. What are you talking about? Everything, all trade exists on is the government. Like, without the government, you don't even own things. Society as a whole must recognize this ownership, which comes about and concretizes through a government and a constitution, etc.
What this ideology amounts to is a dogma. It's a dogma that private markets are the best, and through the invisible hand, they always give the consumer and therefore the whole of society what's best, what's optimal. And then any form of government goes against that. So all that we can do is minimize government. And like, as I'm talking about in my new book about Venezuela, if like you talk to one of these people who believes in neoclassical economics and you point out a place where government central planning made life better for people like Venezuela, they'll just explain around it in order to work backwards from their conclusion and say, no. All the bad things that happened in Venezuela were because of the government. All the good things were because of private markets. Same with China, right? All China's economic growth, that's because of the private markets. Anything bad that happened, that's because of the government and central planning. It's a dogma that, resembles any other kind of religious faith that you would have, where they just worship the invisible hand of the market instead of a god.
Needs are taken care of equally. Instead of individuals choosing what goods and services they prefer to spend their money on, they are provided only with what goods and services the central planners have chosen for them. Some people may reject the central plan. The result is that socialist countries tend to be politically authoritarian. The economic consequences of central planning
I don't get how people think there can't be demand under socialism either. Like there can never be any demand inputs. It's just all what the central planners want. Like that state central plan is all based on what the people want. Like in China, the way they do it is there's party cadres who are assigned to every area. And it's their job to communicate with the people, understand what the people want, and bring that back to the party and to the government and to the sectors of economic power so that, you know, they can produce what the people need and what they want. That is demand, right? Markets oftentimes don't meet the demand of society as a whole. They can often meet the demand of those who have the most money, but they leave a lot of people wanting, even in vital industries like housing, healthcare, and food.
Well, this has always been very interesting.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to play that.
This argument's always been very interesting to me because they assume that we're not forced to only buy what these companies are selling, right? As if we ask for things and they make them. That's not how it works, right? They provide things and we buy them. We don't get to choose what's being made. So their whole idea that people are choosing, it's either, well, do we get a say by the people asking us what we want? Or do we not get a say and only what is made in the interests of these companies making more money off us? And that's what gets made. You know what I mean?
For example, profits reward and encourage innovation and efficiency. If you are the first to create a new product or find a cheaper way to provide a service, the individual who risks capital is financially rewarded.
Can we pause real quick?
There is no incentive.
I'm sorry. It's so much. They've completely eliminated the production process and they act as if the owners are the ones innovating. Like Elon Musk is sitting at his desk designing rockets. That's not what happens. Workers are the ones innovating, right? There are people thinking up better ways to do things, etc. But they're not always the owner of something.
No, they found that most innovations come from like the assembly line, come from, you know, the people who are closest to the product. Of course, right. It comes from the people working with the product every day. And there are engineers whose literal job is to use science and what we know about technology and physics to innovate, right? And any innovations created by those engineers aren't going to lead to higher pay. They're paid a set salary. It's going to lead to more money for the boss. And then they say, if you invest capital in a good idea, you're rewarded. How many people in a country where 70% of us live paycheck to paycheck have capital to just invest in a new idea, right? So really, capitalism is a fetter on innovation because regular people who have good ideas, who have good innovations, aren't incentivized to bring them forward. They don't have the resources to bring them forward, especially in our, monopolized financial state of capitalism that we live in, where capital and wealth are so heavily concentrated at the top.
Or worse, they're working for someone else, have that idea, and those bastards steal the idea, take ownership of it, and profit off of it. You think the McDonald's shareholders invented the chicken McNugget? They did not.
Well, that was Thomas Edison,
right?
Elon Musk is just a modern day Thomas Edison.
Exactly.
Are paying 100%. People to make innovations for them and then claiming that they did it.
Right. The idea that capitalists are innovating is so silly, and maybe a handful of people during the Industrial Revolution, yes, especially in the US, where there were protections put in place to allow that sort of thing to happen from the government, then okay, a very, very small section, but that is the exception, not the rule.
Yep.
To innovate because the rewards go back to the planners. Central planners only on their own knowledge, which is always less than the collective knowledge of society. Think of the difference between a published encyclopedia, which is static and quickly becomes dated, and a decentralized alternative, like Wikipedia, which is constantly evolving and growing. Markets.
and filled with bullshit. And also, markets don't give people 100% in information. You know, we don't know what's going on in the markets.
No, that acts as if we're all informed consumers. I know nothing about most of the things I buy. Nothing.
A unique piece of knowledge: prices. Since many resources, such as steel, have a variety of different end uses, prices signal whether the use of a specific resource satisfies the top priority of the community. Should a factory produce
No, they
hammers
don't.
or nails? In a market economy, prices indicate when there is a greater need for one product over another.
So this stems back to what I wrote my article about in the utility theory of value, right? Price is heavily correlated to wage, or the amount of labor content and labor time that's in a product. Paul Cockshott has done that by looking at every industry and the prices of the commodities in that industry versus the amount of labor that goes into them, and they're over 94% corollary. But what these guys try and do is say, no. Prices are determined by consumer demand, where consumer demand intersects with supply. And then you ask them, okay, well, let's test that scientifically. How do you measure consumer demand? Well, you can't. You can't quantify consumer demand. Well, then our theory is unfalsifiable. We're just plotting, we're finding the price point on a graph and saying this is where the D and the S intersect. Well, the D and the S are subjective. You just made them up. Alfred Marshall pulled them out of his ass so that, the bourgeoisie would have an economic science to use after Marx destroyed classical economics. That's all this is.
Maybe we should go over how value is alienated human labor real quick. I mean, the value, say where a commodity has a price, right? Or value is realized in the value form, money, when it's sold by the capitalist, right? What has happened before this is they buy all of the commodities it takes to make the commodity they're going to make. This includes human labor, right? All of the constant capital going into it, and then the variable capital. Now, the price of these commodities that it takes to make it, and then the value going into it from the labor, turns these commodities into something new, a new thing. The labor is transferred from the workforce into this commodity, which is then sold, right? And the value of this commodity is then higher than the materials it took to make it and the labor that went into it. And the difference there is what we call surplus value, right? Everything beyond what they pay the workers. And if it weren't that much more valuable, then it wouldn't get made.
Yes, I think that was worth explaining for sure.
In a command economy, government blindly makes that decision. Without economic...
Pause it real quick. Government blindly just makes this. China is like racing ahead of the West. How can they just sit here and lie? It's crazy. They can say anything because there's money behind it.
Yep.
Enabled by prices, a complex economy becomes impossible. The socialist goal of redistribution of wealth makes the...
So this actually stems from a Mises idea, which is called the economic calculation problem, which is the idea that it fits in perfectly with Alfred Marshall's utility theory of value, which is the idea that the economy is so complex, there's so many inputs, you can never plan an economy, even though, there have been planned economies, and Paul Cockshott has shown how calculation technology has evolved and computers have evolved to make it fairly easy to plan an economy. And actually, there's so much concentration and monopolization that private firms like Walmart essentially centrally plan, where they're going to have all their commodities based on the behavior of consumers and things like that. It's basically a system of central planning that could be used. That same sort of technology could be used to plan a socialist economy. So The thesis in Mises' economic calculation problem is that, yeah, I mean, he claims to know the future, and I wrote about this in my article responding to the neoclassical economists as well. But he says socialism will never, ever, ever, ever be possible because of how complex the capitalist economy is. And how could you say that? How could you know how technology is going to evolve? How could you say it's completely impossible to do anything? So it's a dogma, like I said, a dogma that there can never be any kind of planning. The market will always do better, which is clearly false. Look at China's poverty alleviation. That has put a nail in the coffin of that argument for good. But these neoclassical economists still hang on to it. And like I said, they say, oh, no, that's just because of capitalism in China. And anything bad in China is because of the government. It is literally religious faith and the economic calculation problem, the idea that no kind of planning will ever be possible. We know because we adhere to the invisible hand like it's a god. It's an example of the dogmatic nature of the whole thing. And the Koch brothers have spent millions and millions and millions of dollars on institutes like the Mises Institute, pushing this ideology and calling it economics, pretending, it's a real field of study and there's some sort of objective scientific analysis going on here, when really it's nothing more than a bourgeois dogma, a religion that worships capital.
The basic mistake of not understanding how wealth is created.
I love that they say we don't understand how wealth is created.
And production.
So, yeah, right.
Well, they don't even
just explain how wealth is created. Surplus value.
Production will see the quality of life for everyone decline. Often, politicians today will not go so far as to call for the socialization of every part of the.
Sorry, they just said it causes every area of life to decline. Again, something that's empirically false. Like Howard Waitskin did a full comparative study of socialist to capitalist countries, and the socialist countries outperform them in terms of standard of life. And if you look at any socialist country, what did they have before and then what did they have after the revolution? Massive increases in education, healthcare, feeding people, combating malnutrition, and all sorts of good things that have improved people's lives. But the neoclassicals don't deal with empirical data, right? They don't deal with reality. You can explain this to them and they'll just find some way to explain it away and say, no, that was because of capitalism. It was because they didn't fully abolish private markets, that the markets were able to increase people's standard of living. It's nothing but a dogma. There's no science going on here.
Economy, only for certain sectors like healthcare, roads, and education. While a mixed economy of markets and socialist services can function better than a purely socialist economy, there are problems that still exist. For example,
yeah, let's privatize the fucking roads and let's get rid of Medicare and Medicaid, the only public forms of healthcare that we have that are the only reason there's only 40,000 people dying because they don't have access to healthcare in this country instead of freaking 200,000 or way more if you got rid of Medicare and Medicaid. I had a professor who adhered to this neoclassical ideology. And she also worked for the insurance industry. And I can't remember where I was going with that now. Sorry. I confronted her with the evidence. I said, our healthcare system's the only one that's highly privatized, and we're the only one that have this for-profit insurance industry. And 40,000 people are dying in America every year because they don't have access to health insurance, whereas that doesn't happen in other countries. You know what she said? She said, oh, well, I'm sure those studies were made up, or those studies were funded by leftists. So again, you can present empirical data to these people who adhere to this ideology. And if they really adhere to it, like my economics professor did, they will find some way to explain it away. Anything that says, central planning or the government could do something good is literally fake. It was created by the big lobby of socialists that's out there funding research, I guess. We got to get them to hit us up and give us some money.
Right. It's wild to me that people can seriously, think about who it is telling us this. It is literally the people who want to own our shit. What little stuff is owned by the people, they want to take it for themselves. And they're like, Yes, but you will be better off if I own everything and sell it to you. That's basically what they're saying.
Yes.
And people are like, that makes sense. Absolutely.
It's exactly what they're saying. And then they frame freedom then
Right.
equals freedom for the owning class to own everything and sell it back to you.
A truly socialist healthcare system forces decisions about the use of scarce resources, like hospital beds, machines, and
Oh my, that is the dumbest argument. Every single healthcare system has scarce resources. Every single healthcare system rations goods. It doesn't matter if it's capitalist or socialist or feudal. Again, every single healthcare system has a limited amount of resources and they have to ration it. You know what we ration it by in the United States? By your pocketbook. If you have enough money to afford healthcare, you get really good healthcare. You can have access to all sorts of specialists. It's going to be extremely expensive, but who cares? You have money, right? You know who the healthcare system doesn't work for? People who can't afford super expensive specialists. That's why 40 to 60,000 people die every year in this country, despite the fact that we have or spend more money on healthcare than any other country by far. Because we have to ration that care, and we ration it by you get care if you're rich, you don't if you're poor. What socialized medicine does is rations care by need. It says we have a limited amount of resources. Whoever needs it more, whoever has life-threatening illnesses gets it first. Whereas in the U.S., millions of dollars are spent on like men's balding, medicine, and cosmetic surgery, plastic surgery. Shit aimed for super rich people or aimed at super rich people. That is where our scarce goods go in a privatized capitalist healthcare system. In a socialized healthcare system, our healthcare resources go towards people with cancer and people who actually fucking need it. This is kind of my thing is healthcare right now. So I get real fired up about these bullshit arguments.
And the scarcity is connected to what's invested in what. The scarcity at times is artificial just because it's not profitable to invest more in that area. For instance, you did an article a while back on the scarcity of hospitals in rural parts of America. Was it scarce because we don't have the resources to provide people in the rural parts of America with hospitals that are not 3-4 hours away from their homes? No, that's not the way that it was scarce. It was scarce because they just didn't invest in it because it wasn't profitable, right? So the scarcity is itself artificial because capitalist production is production for the sake of profit. And if you cannot realize profit, you don't develop production in those areas. And that's why it becomes a fetter on the development of humanity, on the development of the forces of production. And you see the complete opposite. You see the complete opposite in China, which as soon as COVID hit, they were able to build like 10 hospitals or a hospital in less than 10 days. And just these massive hospitals and these massive infrastructures that were done through central planning. The most efficient parts of the capitalist economy is itself done through planning. There's a wonderful book called The People's Republic of Walmart that goes through how it is that Walmart participates in planning in order to succeed. And the question is, what are they planning for? What's the end, the telos of the planning? It's profit. Now the question is, what would the end of the planning be in socialism? It's for the good of the people. It's whatever the people need. And so it's, to have this dichotomy of planning and market and then the scarcity is artificial. The scarcity is artificial. When you have the capacity to produce in accordance to what it is that people need, to what it is that's going to make people's lives easier to be flourishing, you're going to be able to break through all of those scarcities as we've seen in China, especially when you're not burdened down by, a blockade like, for instance, Cuba is.
The idea that we have scarcity in 2023 is absolutely absurd. There are so many news stories about millions and millions of tons of food being destroyed while people go hungry. Well, between 1 in 5 and 1 in 8 children go hungry in this country, right? So what was the food just scarce so they had to drive up the prices so these kids can't eat? No, there's far more than enough food. We have what's called the crisis of overproduction within capitalism. And this is explained from Marx. But basically, we make so much for profit. And the working end is also the buying end. What's made mathematically is always more than what can purchase, right? So I don't want to go through the whole thing, but the idea that these things are scarce is absolute fucking nonsense.
Medicines to be decided not by individuals, families, or doctors, but by government planners. While patients of
That's bullshit. Because in
I
Cuba,
know.
you see it in the polyclinic model. It's like so embedded in the community with the nurses, with the doctors, and everyone else. It's just lying. You know, there's this thing that this great Mexican historian says. He's the biographer of Che. He's got a massive Che biography. His name is um, Pablo Taibo II or something. He's got somewhat of a weird name. But one of the statements that he makes is that, you know, you what you have to ask of reactionaries is at least to be honest, right? They can be the pieces of shit that they want to be, but at least stop lying. Say the truth. And the stuff that they're saying is just verifiably untrue. Look at any socialist system. The planning is not just these government bureaucrats that are disconnected from any of the people that are going to get the treatment or that are going to get the services that are being planned for. The planning is done by the people that are engaged in those activities. And yes, at some point it ripples upward to the bureaucrats, but their decisions are based on the stuff that's being done by the people that are there, as opposed to when it's, when it's capitalism. The CEOs don't know what the fuck is going on. They don't know if the doctor tells them, yeah, we need to continue these services in the rural regions of the country because people need them. If they're not profitable, the capitalist is not going to stay there.
Yeah, it's the exact opposite, right? It's socialist healthcare, like the healthcare in Cuba that brought healthcare even to the rural areas by the Escambray. That was based on what individuals, families, and doctors want, right? They want to bring healthcare to the entire country. Versus in the U.S., we've had 100 rural hospitals shut down in the last 10 years, well over 100 rural hospitals, and we've written on this because, like Carlos said, it's not profitable. So it's the exact inverse, right? They say that under capitalism, these are the people running healthcare. How? How did individuals, families, and doctors influence the COVID response? Maybe doctors to some degree, and most physicians at this point own their own practices, so they're essentially capitalists. But it was controlled by government bureaucrats and, more importantly, the pharmaceutical corporations, or giant corporations owned by a handful of shareholders.
Eddie,
But
how
those
many times?
doctors even weren't really doctors that were practicing medicine. They were doctors involved in administration and in the World Health Organization and in propaganda. I mean, for real, like, people might give me some guff for this, but Fauci was saying contradictory things from week to week. So his job at that point was to lie to us sometimes, no matter which way you look at it.
And this video shows the exact inverse. These are the government planners. How? This is the shareholders. These are the people selling you medicine and running out the back door and using intellectual property laws to make sure that cheaper generic medicine isn't produced or even imported. Right? This is exactly how the healthcare system. This is exactly how the healthcare system works under capitalism, and they just invert it.
Yeah, it's a topsy-turvy view. And I wanted to ask, because the last one, it mentions family and nurses and doctors. How many times have either of you had, when you were younger, when you were a kid, a nurse or a doctor at your house? I'm guessing the answer is never. I was just looking at these old cassette videos of me in Cuba, and there was always this random lady that I had no idea who it was, and that was the nurse, the polyclinic nurse, and everyone had one. You always had a fucking nurse in your house that would visit you every week, that was so embedded with the family, that knew what fucking abuelita was doing and how everyone in the house was doing, because it's completely embedded in the community, and that's why it's so successful, and it's capable of being preventative, right, as opposed to just reacting to when people get sick. So it's all bullshit. Everything that they've spewed in this video has all been lies.
And I want to say too, at the level of healthcare administration in the U.S., they understand what needs to be done to improve healthcare. They understand that having people embedded in the community who have a more holistic view of health, who understand the problems that their patients are going through, is a better way to go about things and a better way to provide people health care, because you have to address a lot of social factors. They know that preventative medicine is better than just, covering up people's symptoms with medication. They know this. But the discussion is, how do we do this? How do we get to this? Because the whole system is run by shareholders and bureaucrats who are just going to do whatever's better for profit. Preventative medicine is terrible for profit. You want a sick population who you can constantly throw pills at to make money off of. You do not want a healthy population where preventative medicine is key. Where preventative medicine and healthcare is emphasized.
Look how long they hid the research on tobacco from us. They knew for a fact how deadly tobacco was. They knew it was addictive. They knew it caused cancer, and they hid this research. The big tobacco cartel hid the research to keep selling cigarettes. And guess what? That falls right in line with the healthcare industry, because it's about selling us things, and not even us, but rich people who can afford it. When I was 12, my mom had a giant heart attack, right? Worst thing that had happened to my family. But at the time, she had multiple heart attacks and needed a heart transplant. At the time, this was experimental technology, right? And she had to get on this thing called a heart mate, which was only open to certain people and would cost millions and millions of dollars. My dad and some doctors had to lie to get her involved in this just to save her life. Otherwise, us being just a regular poor working class family, my mom wouldn't be alive today. It's so beyond fucked up that they can sit here and make this video lying about it, because it kills people. It genuinely fucking kills people.
It almost makes you think, it almost makes you think whether there's like communists inside the Mises Institute, because this is so very clearly the stupidest place that they should be arguing for a free market for, especially in the US. Especially in the US, where so many, literally everyone is affected by how stupid having the private healthcare for-profit model in medicine is. It's almost as if they're trying to look like they're idiots and their ideology makes no fucking sense.
No kidding. Why would you highlight healthcare like this?
Go to
Medicare. You know what the most highly approved of insurance premiums are in the entire country? Medicare and Medicaid. The only places where you can get insurance from the government.
Mm-hmm. More and more, though, it seems like the truth is becoming so essential to people that this kind of thing is doing what Carlos was just saying, having the reverse effect.
Right.
Back maybe 20 years ago, people bought it. There was a big fad of libertarians, if you remember. But now, not so much. People need the truth, because the reality is we can't keep going on in the old way. Things are reaching a point where something's going to happen. Something's going to give. So not to change the subject, but organize right now. Join the Communist Party, join whatever is around, build a union, meet the people in your neighborhood. Organize now. We need to do this together, because otherwise it's going to be wackadoos like the people who made this video running things. And
yeah.
I want to just get to two comments here because they're connected to the polyclinic point that we made. SM Palazzolo, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. He says, "I'm old. I did. Doctor lived around the corner." Yeah, you get that in certain rural communities. There's this show on Netflix that's it's a what they'd call a chick flicks, but it's enjoyable. It's called Virgin River, and you have the doctor in the community, and he's still very much embedded in the community. But that's like basically gone, a long gone reality in most of the U.S. as hospitals and community clinics have continued to just leave communities. And Kyle Pettis says, "When I lived in Nicaragua, I had a Cuban doctor that came to my house when I had chicayunga." I'm guessing I'm pronouncing that. I don't know. It was the best, most personal care I ever had. Right. And, the part of what the Cuban surplus of doctors has afforded Cuba to do is send doctors all over the place. The slogan is doctors, not bombs. The U.S. sends bombs. Cuba sends doctors. So that experience that you had in Nicaragua is one that people in Venezuela have had. It's one that people in Brazil had. Like Bolsonaro, when COVID started, he sent the Cuban doctors back, and then he had to ask for them to come back because everything went to shit. So people around the world have had those experiences. And Helen Yaffe, who's one of the leading scholars in the English world on Cuba, she cites that millions, hundreds of millions of people have been treated by Cuban doctors around the world and have been either saved or have had their illnesses treated by Cuban doctors.
Yeah, Venezuela didn't even, I mean, Cuba gives them doctors too, but also Cuba guided them with their programs aimed at expanding healthcare access and bringing it to the rural areas. So they basically replicated the same thing Cuba did with Cuba's help. And that's a form of central planning involving the government that vastly improved people's lives and brought people an incredible amount of healthcare. But these guys at the Mises Institute, they're so out of touch that in America, where 60% of our country has had medical debt at some point, they're telling you, we can't do anything different than capitalism, guys. We'd lose our awesome healthcare system. And that's why people are starting to see through this shit, because so many of them have had a terrible experience with this healthcare system that these guys are trying to uphold as the greatest.
That's like if my boss were to like come up to me and be like, hey, give me your house. Just give it to me. I want to make some money off of it. Like, what are you talking about?
That's what privatization is. They just have to dress it up with all this neoclassical nonsense.
It's a bunch of nonsense. It's all mental gymnastics for the owners to go, we want to make more money selling you things. Let us own more to sell you. Let us make you dependent on us. So you need us.
Right. That's their conclusion. And then, whatever mental gymnastics they have to do to say that that's the best way to go about things is what they do. It is a dogmatic faith.
By the way, this is one of the ways I talk to libertarians too. And I explain, like, why on earth do you want to be dependent on these corporations, these spoiled little rich kids that have never done a day's work in their life? You want to be dependent on them to get what you need? Man, stand up for yourself,
Doctor, they may face other critical obstacles like long wait times, medicine shortages, and rationing of care, all resulting in a lack of medical freedom. Economics explains why freedom makes society richer and more prosperous. The case for socialism.
So that's what I was saying earlier, is they then equate any privatization with freedom. It all equals freedom. And all it means is freedom for what Noah said, your boss to own everything and then to sell it back to you. That's what freedom is. Freedom for capital.
Is not grounded in economics, but an appeal to equality.
Not true.
The result is to make people equally poor.
We've known people who have died because they've had to ration their insulin and other medicine in the U.S., right? We know how long it takes for people to just get basic appointments to the doctor, especially in rural areas of the country. It could take months for them to get seen, right? So it's so absurd. They're talking about long wait lines, rationing, and whatever the other third thing was. All of those are things that are endemic to American capitalist healthcare and that virtually are inexistent in other socialist forms of healthcare. And the few times that you have rationing that's needed, it's because the country cannot get resources because of the blockade. I recently wrote a paper for Science for the People magazine on the effects of the U.S. blockade on Cuban medicine and the shortages that are caused by Cuban in the Cuban healthcare system by the blockade, which is a dynamic blockade that shifts its ways around so that any way that the U.S. That the Cuban government finds to negotiate with a company from around the world, it can adjust itself eventually so that it's a dynamic blockade that reacts to the Cuban reactions to try to work around the blockade. And it's all of every I know it sounds bold, but it's not when you study this. Every single central problem that the Cuban economy faces, but their healthcare system in particular, is tied to the blockade. It's tied to the blockade and the inability to access things that are absolutely crucial in order for the economic well-being of the country.
So much for the free market, huh?
Right, right.
It's
Someone
our
mentioned earlier in the
corporations
chat.
running this blockade and how it works, not to mention every sanction in the entire world. Um, I think it's interesting that, they preach free market to us to loosen restrictions on them to own more and then control the market more. They have no interest and never have in a free market. They do not want competition. Why would any capitalist enterprise ever want competition? That cuts into its profits. That's
Right.
insane of them to want competition.
It's free markets for the third world, and it's protectionism for the first world, so that they can protect the profits of the companies that are in the global north, and so that the third world can be freely looted. They want free markets there, so that means that over there, what you're getting is access to cheap resources, access to super exploiting labor. That's why you want the deregulation, the liberalization, the austerity for the people, the privatization. You want all that for the third world. And then for the first world, you want protectionism. You want the government to step in so that people can only buy from this company, and so that goods from other countries get higher tariffs. And you want all of this stuff to go on when it's for you, but then the free market for everyone else, so that you can benefit from free markets when you benefit from them. And when you don't, you say, no more free market. Where's my government to help me get profits?
Lenin has one of my favorite quotes from Lenin. He says, freedom for whom? To do what? And in this case, it is always the freedom of finance capital to make everyone else dependent on it and extract wealth from the third world, from us, from everybody. And what they do is, well, I'm not going to go through like the horrible jackboot that they put on the global south. I mean, everyone knows that. But it's the idea that they can even use the word freedom is absurd.
The freedom to exploit. That's all it is.
Yeah.
There was this one Lenin quote that, just to end on a lighter note, there was this one Lenin quote that he ended on, socialism being actually freedom for the toilers. And I had autocorrect mess up toilers, and it wrote toilets, and it was freedom for the toilets. I didn't notice it until it was out. But, we got a few super chats here. I don't know, Eddie, you have something?
I was just gonna say the toilets will be liberated under socialism. So
Yeah, everything will be liberated. Organic things, inorganic things,
the
inorganic.
animals will all be vegan.
The animals, yeah, we'll force the animals to be vegan, by the way.
They'll be vegan too. Yeah.
Well, every animal is going to be vegan too.
We can plan everything in socialism. Sarcasm again, by the way, folks. I always feel like I gotta put that out there. And some people have told me too. I've said some absurd shit, and then somebody will be like, do you really think that? I'm like, no, I was kidding. Hell yeah, no. Oh, sorry. You can respond to this one, Noah.
Oh, it's real. Well, okay, I will. Yes, my blood is also coffee. My son, when he was young, by the way, thank you, Kyle. My son, when he was younger, used to call coffee my brain juice. But so I was going to say about forcing animals to be vegan. My wife and I, we used to go to weird car trips to bizarre museums and stuff, right? And like tourist attractions. And we went to the Creationism Museum, right? Yeah. I told Carlos the story. And so we're sitting there, and there's this giant thing of Noah's Ark. And so, of course, we go see Noah's Ark, right? And the thing is, their whole shtick was dinosaurs and people all existed at the same time. And I'm there, and I'm kind of scratching my head. I'm like, how did they keep the Tyrannosauruses from just eating the shit out of every other animal, right? and this teenage kid like going, ooh, I'm gonna get to school the adult, right? Comes up behind me and like not smug, a nice way, like, don't you remember? They didn't start eating meat till after the flood. And I'm like, oh, you poor kid.
That was me. That was me.
Like he was nice, and it just like genuinely, like I just kind of felt bad for him, and I don't want to. Like, I'm sure, you know, as he grows up, he'll be fine. And I don't want to like talk shit on religion. Religion's absolutely great. It's just, it was a very funny situation.
Oh yeah,
vegan T-Rexes would be great.
That could have been me. My parents used to take me to the Focus on the Family Museum, which is like, I just thought of it as like a radio show that we would always listen to, but it was actually funded by some like far right billionaire, like Christian theocrats, basically. So that little kid could have been me. Have you guys heard the Marxist theory that dinosaurs never existed? Because like paleontology and that stuff really kind of took off in England around the same time as capitalism. So there's a theory that paleontologists and archaeologists were just piecing together bones to make it look crazy as shit so that they could sell a lot of museum tickets. Be like, look what this ancient animal we found. It's 20 feet tall.
You know what's funny? The first notebook in Dialectics of Nature, it's usually arranged like this in the version that most people have, which is I think the 1963 version that the Soviet Union did. But the first article is Engels debunking this guy that would take pictures of people and manipulate the pictures so that it looked like there was a ghost. So it was him debunking this whole science of like ghosts and stuff. And it's a pretty funny read, and it's very weird because you read this amazing introduction, and then you get to the first chapter and you're like, what the fuck did I just read? Then it goes back to being like super serious and super like thorough and rigorous. But it's the debunking, you know, these con mans that would take a picture of someone and like put fingers or something. So
there were a lot of those back then. There was you know, what's his face? Oh, what was the guy's name? Super famous magician and escape artist. People use his name
Houdini.
to actually mean magician.
Houdini.
Harry Houdini. Harry Houdini got really into going to these like fraudsters, seances, and whatever they would do, and exposing them in front of everyone. Right? Like he would like roll up and be like, "Oh, I'm not Harry Houdini, I promise." And he'd go and he'd sit down and they'd be like, "Your foot's moving that table." Psych, I was Houdini all along. It was good. I mean, I don't know.
We got two other super chats. Thank you, Kyle Pettis. It's active super chatter. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kyle.
To the functioning of the institute. He says, yeah, they run the local clinic in Leon. When I visited the Dominican Republic to meet communists, they got a local sports center, opened it, and had a sports med program with Cuban docs who also helped local people in the village. Yeah, they're literally everywhere. It's insane because Cuba, one of the things that I mentioned in the paper that I talked about earlier about the influence of the blockade on Cuban medicine is how you had, for instance, in the University of Havana, out of like 122 medical teachers, 9 were left after the revolution. Like the flee of human social capital was insane. It was 50% in general, but in areas like Havana, it was even higher just because of how bourgeoisified the professionals were in that area. But that same year, Fidel said that we're going to be known as a country of professionals and educated people, which is so insane. You just had 50% of your professionals leave the country, and you're like making this super bold statement. And it's true. Within 2 generations, Cuba started just sending out a bunch of doctors and professionals in various missions around the world. And today there's Cuban doctors basically everywhere.
They're known for it. They're known for being the country that will send doctors everywhere.
The Henry Reeve Brigade was actually created for when Katrina hit, because they
Mm.
offered to send to New Orleans help, and Bush rejected it. But we have another $10 super chat from Kyle Pettis. Um, Unfortunately, the doc I had in Nicaragua died during COVID because he was out helping everyone before the vaccine. He was one of the few to actually die in Leon. Damn. Yeah, they realize that a lot of the times um, that's the risk that they're taking, that they're taking, but they're seen as heroes by the Cuban people, and it's kind of despicable the treatment that the American media gives of them as like slaves of the Cuban government, the Cuban regime. It's so disrespectful to a somewhat of a class of people or a group of people that are literally engaged in these heroic missions and that are seen as like the archetype of the socialist human being, the carrying the legacy of Che Guevara by the Cuban people. And that's a sort of warfare that the U.S. engages with against the countries that it wants to topple. That's not usually talked about. We love talking about sanctions, and we should. We love talking about direct warfare, and we should. But ideological warfare, it's that's why the term hybrid warfare from VJ is so good. It takes so many different forms, and those forms of warfare humanize people that belittle their heroes and their aspirations and all of these things. They're quite disgusting, right? And in this case with the doctor, it's despicable.
You know, it's a really good and stark contrast based on what countries, what ruling classes call heroic and put in that light. In Cuba, it is doctors, it is people who are saving lives. In the US, it is spoiled, lazy, entitled, rich kids who have never worked. It
Elon
is
Musk.
Joe Biden. It is.
I don't think no one's calling Biden a hero. Even the people voting for him.
The Kardashians.
Well, these are the people that.
How about the
well,
Kardashians?
How about
The Kardashians,
how about
yeah.
people like John McCain? They called him a hero, right? And then look at who the working class considers a hero, and it's very different. Sometimes it aligns, sometimes it doesn't. But
let's give Kyle Pettis. Not only is he a union truck driver, but he's given us a lot in super chats today. Let's have a round of applause for him. Thank you, Kyle. As he sends another one. What a guy. Thank you.
thanks, brother.
And that's for all of our super chatters and people sending super stickers. I see we got another one from Stephen Michael Palazzolo. So thank you so much for the constant support. I'm glad you guys are enjoying the stream. We're going to continue to increase production value as the streams continue to grow. And that's all thanks to you. So
I really appreciated the layout that you had this morning with the Streamlabs.
You like that?
That was awesome.
I thought it was pretty good, and there was a lot of potential. A lot of potential in the way that.
There's more that we can do too. Yeah, I didn't have it fully set up, but there's like Patreon integration. There's all sorts of stuff that we can do. So.
Sorry.
Oh, you're good. I just wanted to hit the last super chat. He was definitely a hero. Was born a campesino and died a doctor serving the people on the front line. That's awesome. That's the Cuban Revolution in a nutshell right there, isn't it? That's a great story. Thank you for sharing, Kyle.
And that's the creation of a new human being that Che emphasized so thoroughly. And, it's an organic process. I don't think it could be like forced. But you should be paying special attention to it as a socialist society. Like, how are you promoting a different set of values, a different set of approach, a different way of approaching the world, different worldview within your people, so that you're able to create the sort of population that Cuba was, and that Korea. We talked a little bit earlier about the effects of the fall of the Soviet Union, but in Cuba, 50% of the calories that they were consuming before they lost the caloric intake dropped by 50%. That's absurd. And they were still sticking with the revolution. And a lot of the best art and literature and theoretical developments in Marxism, they come from that period. So it's crazy to see how the social consciousness of the people was developed, and how that's playing a role in sustaining the fight for socialism and sovereignty and human dignity that Cuba represents in the face of such horrific conditions that are created by the blockade.
I think this is something that we should really, really learn from Cuba on. Too much people don't take themselves seriously enough as communists. We don't. I wrote a paper about this a while ago. It's not a very good one. It's called Walk the Walk. And basically,
I like that. I thought it was a good one.
well, thank you. It's a short little thing that basically says we must hold ourselves to a higher standard. People see us as communists. And if we are serious about leading the working classes to revolution and to creating something better, we need to be better. We need to be good people. And not just like in a vague way. We need to embody being a good person, an upstanding person, a dignified person, someone above reproach, someone who studies, but not to act like they're smarter than everyone else, to help everyone else learn. Someone who works hard to get the job done, not to show off. And someone who helps their coworkers, their fellow students, whatever it is. Always be helping your brothers and sisters. We're in this together. And when they see communists do this, that's when they get inspired. That's when something greater happens.
Right, and that stuff's important to talk about. Like, look at how Jordan Peterson rose to prominence, basically through talking about politics, being a right-winger, and then doing self-help. You know, and there's, like, communism and Marxism does focus on the systemic analysis of things a lot, but there's also things that Marxism teaches us about the individual and what it means to be an individual and what it means to be an effective organizer. And if you look at any of the revolutionary leaders, Kim Il-sung we were talking about earlier, Ho Chi Minh, Lenin, they were all sort of Mao, they were all sort of these incredible people who had, they were Che Guevara, Fidel, they were physically adept. And they were socially adept. They could talk to anyone and communicate with anyone, and they were extremely well read, so they were mentally adept. So they were really well-rounded people. And then if you look in America, leaders like Henry Winston, W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, not that these people didn't have their flaws and their errors, we're all still human, but they were largely really good at everything they did, and really honorable people on the individual level. Thank you so much, Leon Trotsky, for 10 euros. Sorry, I just want to get thank you, Fleon. Appreciate you. And thank you so much, Popers, for becoming a YouTube member. Appreciate you.
That's an interesting name, too. Fleon
Trotsky.
Fleon Trotsky. Well, I mean,
oh, there you go.
Quickly, right?
Fleon Trotsky. Yeah.
There's multiple ways you can do that. There's a flea on him. Flee on, like flee, Trotsky, flee on.
Leon Trotsky.
Although, like, let's be real, don't flee too quickly. Bad joke. But no, when I talk about this, often I'll get younger people say, well, Lenin was a shitposter. Right? And things like that. And my response to that is, are you Lenin? When you have gained the respect and the love of millions upon millions of people that Lenin had and still has years and years after he's dead and will always have for all of history, then talk to me about where and when we can be disrespectful. Until then, grow a set.
Or learn to discern, what's a good time to give a biting critique or, throw a joke out there versus, a lot of people just get emotional, I think, online in conversations with people and immediately jump to condemning them, you're the worst. And it's like in those regular conversations with people, we don't need to be losing our cool, and then the people Lenin was giving biting critiques of were the leaders of his political enemies, the leaders of groups opposing the Bolsheviks, at the time. So he was engaging with their ideas, their thought, not necessarily the individual working class people who might have been following the Mensheviks and Kautsky or whatever.
Precisely.
He was brutal with the leaders,
Oh, yeah.
perhaps for ways in which I don't know if we should be today, but different contexts.
Mm.
Marx was Marx was getting at like the body weight of Bakunin and just horrible. So I don't think we can be a little bit more quote unquote civilized in our critiques of the opponents. But thank you, Poppers, for becoming a YouTube member. I believe YouTube members, and is it YouTube members or just Patreon members that get a copy, an ebook of the book?
Patreon. I want to make that available for YouTube members too. Should work on that soon.
Yeah.
YouTube members get like special emotes and stuff specific to YouTube.
Someone mentioned that we should make an emote of Noah doing the pen thing.
Oh yes, I can totally do that. That would not even take that long.
No, it wouldn't.
I don't think it'll be hard to find a still of me doing it.
Yeah, no, not at all.
But just to get back to the question of the individual, because I think it's so important, and it gets at another myth that it's perhaps not as frequent, but it's still it's still one of the talking points, which is that communism is the destruction of the individual. There's no role of the individual, and it couldn't be any farther from the truth. Like Marx comes at the form of critique that he ends up developing into dialectical materialism, and then in its application to society and history, historical materialism. He gets to that through an analysis of how it is that the existing mode of life, prevents individuals from being fully human, right? He had this idea that he takes up from Feuerbach, which is Gattungswesens, that we're species being, and as opposed to, he extended it beyond Feuerbach. And for him, what it meant to be human was to be able to participate in conscious life activity. So to be able to labor creatively in accordance with a certain set of standards of beauty, and to objectify yourself onto nature, which is something that you could do socially with other people. Objectify yourself onto nature and see your creation there and appreciate it. And if you talk to artists today, or the few craftsmen that still exist, these are people that will tell you, when I work to create something that I want to create and I have it in front of me and I can look at it and decide what I do with it, it's a completely different relationship than any other thing that I've ever done in my life. And that's de-alienated labor. You're not separating yourself from the process of production, from your work. You're not separating yourself from the product. And as this Marx would say, that if the Gattungswesen, the essence of what it means to be human, your species essence, species being, is to be able to do this thing, you're not separating yourself from that, which is something that's integral to capitalism. So the question of the individual and how can we create the sort of social conditions, the forms of intercourse which allow the flourishing of the individual, is fundamental for Marxism. And what he ends up seeing is a dialectical conclusion, which is that only in society, only in an unalienated society, communist society, can the individual truly be free. Only in community, in that form of community, can the individual truly be free. So there's not community here, individual here, we prioritize this, we ignore this, or we prioritize this and we ignore this. No, we see that the interest of the individual in reality is always embedded with that of the community. And that for one to flourish, the other one must flourish as well.
And this is another dichotomy that the sort of ideologues of neoclassical economics always try to force into us. But like Carlos just said, it's both, right? It isn't the individual or the collective. It is the individual the individual relies on the collective, and the collective relies on the individual. It's the two parts of one whole.
We're all individuals within a collective, and collectives are all made up of individuals.
Without the workers that extracted the coffee beans that I just consumed 3 minutes ago, I wouldn't be able to suggest to Eddie and Noah that we should be streaming for another 3 hours. What do you guys think?
I'm down to try and hit a 6-hour stream if that's what Hassan does.
Instead of
I might
reacting
fall
to
asleep.
I hate you
instead of
both.
reacting to videos, let's just watch the young Karl Marx and react to it.
Here you go.
We could
But,
we could do a stream of writing. Like we'll just write, and you guys can watch us.
Oh,
That'll be really, really entertaining.
that would be awesome.
It'll be like 2 people watching by the time that we're 5 minutes in. Thank you, Battle Cossack, for the 225 of some currency that
Argentina, I think. Someone said that
Oh.
earlier because I'm trying to learn the currencies.
You know, Argentinians have the best steak. Their meat is uncomparable. It's called churrasco, and it's amazing. They also have a in terms of their society, they're the most philosophical of societies, perhaps even more than France. They have a bunch of philosophy shows in their regular television channels, and there's quite a few philosophers that are just like regular household names in Argentina.
Huh. That's
Very cool.
Left is best in the chat just said they were going to send a TYT video that apparently they got in trouble for or got canceled for about Ukraine. I'm really curious to see what that is, but maybe we can save it for another day if Noah's running out of stream, but there's Steam. Stream. That's funny. Long stream. I will watch to the end. Thank you, Sam. Here, we'll give you a round of applause for that. We appreciate your dedication to Midwestern Marx. Yeah.
Oh, you know what?
Guys,
I don't
sorry,
want to. I can't find it because it was so long ago. Someone asked me what my tattoos were earlier. I just want to say they're embarrassing. That's what they are. No, I got them all when I was younger. It was a very bad period of my life. I saw some prison ones, that kind of thing. I'm now very much no longer lumpenized. We'll say that.
Do we want to tackle Battle Cossack's question about Jesus?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's in certain letters from Marx. Supposedly, they ask him like, "Where has communism ever worked?" And he says, "Go look at the writings of Saint Paul." So the late Engels, towards the end of his life, he studied a lot of early Christian communities, and he saw a bunch of homologies, a bunch of overlaps with the embryonic socialist movement. And the reality is that if you read some of the key theologians of Christianity, people like St. Augustine, who was actually African. If you read his work, like what semblance of political economy you can get from it is communistic. It's a form of primary or primitive communism. So yeah, there's definitely a communistic ethic embedded in Christianity and a promotion of a form of life that is definitely socialistic. And yes, it has been used since its 3rd century absorption into the Roman Empire as a way of making people dormant, of keeping people down, of keeping people accepting their current exploitation for the sake of this other world that they'll be the first ones in. But it also has its as a contradictory force. It also has a positive side, which has been used in many progressive struggles, starting from the ancient, not ancient, the German peasant rebellions with Thomas Munster and many other rebellions. Latin America liberation theology is huge. Nicaragua is a Christian socialist country at the moment, and it's been so for a while. In the U.S., some of the key progressive struggles have been waged by the Black Church, which is it has historically been progressive and very much connected to the Black freedom movement from the beginning of the struggle against slavery. So it's a contradictory force, but it does have a certain communistic kernel that we could definitely pull from.
Well, the first abolitionist, official abolitionist piece of like potential legislation was from the Shakers.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, a lot of the early utopian experiments were based in Christian radicalism.
Hmm.
And I mean, I really think of the famous story of Jesus kicking over the money table, right? The money changers were ripping people off, acting as parasites on the people in, God's house, which for Jesus, that was like, oh, fuck this, He didn't get violent often, but that got him violent.
There are also lessons like it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to inherit the kingdom of heaven. Or there's a story I'll always remember where, and I mean, institutionalized religion definitely sucks up people's money and uses religion to suck up people's money. But the message of the story is still good. There's like a poor woman who gives, like 50% of her life savings to the church, which is only like a coin. She doesn't have anything, but what she does have, she gives it to the church. And then there's this rich man who gives to the church millions of dollars to show off, to be like, look at how righteous and pious I am. And the idea is that the poor woman who gave in silence, in secret, not to boast, just out of the goodness of her heart to help, is more valuable than this guy who gave all that money, who just was doing it to show off. So the communist ethic is definitely embedded in religion too, and this idea of selflessness and not fetishizing commodities and just trying to flex as some having a lot of shiny things.
Bertolt Ullmann.
Good point.
Bertolt Ullmann, who was perhaps like the theorist of, or back in the day, the theorist of Marxist theory of alienation. He says that really the theory of commodity fetishism is derived from the critique of fetishism and religious idolatry, which is in certain ways taken up by Feuerbach, and that's the direct influence in Marx. But all of that is rooted in certain forms of critique that were already present in the early Christian community. So it's interesting you bring up fetishism, because that's integral to certain parts of the critique that's found in the more radical tradition in Christianity.
I also think it's really important when we're talking about Marx's criticism of religion. He's not sort of saying religion is good or religion is bad, but understanding it as a human phenomenon,
Right.
Why it exists, how it exists, and what that does. That's why, like, a lot of people may know this, but the whole opium of the masses quote is misquoted more often than not.
Right.
It's part of a longer sentence, and he's talking about how religion became, because there was nothing else, and it developed this way, a way for working people to have some sort of solace. But it was a false solace, right? It wasn't here in the realm of the concrete. It was in some other realm. And so what he's talking about is, as religion, or rather, as society progresses, religion becomes less important, and therefore true solace or liberation becomes more important. And you see this happening within society.
And he was on opium when he said that as well.
Right. Opium of the masses, and
it was just a medical,
like the heart of a heartless world, and
right. So today we think about it as, oh my God, it's this horrible. At the time, it was somewhat of a medicine. It's a way of dealing with another condition, and the point is that the social conditions are horrible. So you have this sort of medicine. He's not condemning the medicine itself. He says if you want to remove the conditions that lead to the necessity of the medicine, what you have to do is change the social conditions that make religion necessary.
I mean, it's a perfect analogy too, though, even as like someone who grew up religious, like that's what it is. It gives people a sense of community outside of capitalism, and a sense of belonging, and a sense of not being alienated from everything all the time. And if you look at the opioid crisis, like, it's a perfect analogy, because now opioids have become the opioids of the masses. You know, more people are secular, but to survive capitalism, a lot of people are being pumped opioids by the pharmaceutical industry, which they're happy to do because it makes them profit. But there's a reason that people, take opioids and like, oh my gosh, I'm finally happy. I can finally relax, because it allows you to forget about the alienation and exploitation that you suffer every day.
One of these days I'll have to tell my story with that. But it's true. It sort of gives people a way to just put all that aside for a little while. And especially if you're in pain, if you play sports or have some injury. And back in the day when I got addicted, doctors had deals with these companies to sell these pills. And that's what they did. And then the pills get more expensive and you need more, and you switch from them to what you can find without the doctor involved. It's cheaper and more readily available. And before you know it, you're, in an alleyway doing heroin. And it's fucking horrible.
It's happened to people I know who are like heavily involved in their church communities, and stand like the kind of people who have never even touched weed in their lives, but they get an injury and then they get prescribed and they're like, holy cow, I can take a pill and all my problems go away. And yeah, it's horrible. That's what most of my Journal of American Socialist Studies 2 article focused on, was using the opioid crisis as an example to highlight how our academic institutions and every aspect of American healthcare, from the government institutions to medical colleges, things like that, have been captured by corporations, been captured by shareholders in the private sector. Yeah,
I'm sure you guys have seen them, but the zombie towns. There's various parts of Philadelphia that it's just people that have gotten to such a point in the addiction where they just look like zombies. And a lot of them are homeless, of course, and you have these streets that are just very zombified looking people. And my dad watches certain vlogs, video vlogs of people from like Latin America that come to the U.S. and they'll record these streets and like make fun of the U.S. for it, and it's good to some extent because you have the idea in the outside of the U.S. that the U.S. is just Hollywood, and even in some of the propaganda that sneaks into Cuba, I've heard in vlogs people say that you get to the U.S. and you can like drink Heineken in a pool every day and eat steak. It's like, fucking right. But it's sad because it's so dehumanizing for a lot of these people, and these are human beings that it's very easy to be like, oh, you did this and it was you who made bad decisions, and that's just untrue, especially with the opioid crisis. These are people that were prescribed these drugs, made dependent on them, and then just removed of their capacity to have them legally, and they have to go to the streets in order to get another drug that's essentially chemically basically the same thing as the one they're being prescribed medically, legally. So it's so despicable. And having the research of Eddie, and I've extended that a bit, not extended it, but I've used it in my article, my chapter that I have coming out in Cuba, to have the knowledge that this was all orchestrated by the pharmaceutical industrial complex in collaboration with the government, in collaboration with NGOs, in collaboration with university, in collaboration with insurances, and everyone was a part of it. With doctors, private doctors are a part of it. 68,000 doctors were bribed. So it's this big network. The Jonathan Marks article that Eddie cites is really good at the interconnections of how many variables were involved in getting millions of Americans addicted, and millions have died in the last 2 decades from it.
Just to reiterate, that's the Journal of American Socialist Studies 2, available on MidwesternMarks.com, where you can get my full analysis of the opioid epidemic and the American healthcare system in general.
And it's one of the best articles I've ever read, by the way. No joke. Wow. And this is coming from someone who was addicted to heroin for 5 years. And I'm now 16 years clean, by the way. But There's actually a documentary that I wish I could remember the name of, where they speak to some of these doctors that were forced to become pill salesmen by the administration of the hospitals they worked.
Wow.
They were just like, look, you push X, Y, and Z. That's what you do. And it's wild. But you mentioned Hollywood and the zombie thing, and I want to mention something about that. I lived in Hollywood, in the bad part, right? I lived on Hollywood and Western, which is right by what's called Little Armenia. I lived in a building that was part apartment building, part youth hostel, and part hotel. I was addicted to heroin and had to dodge crackheads and prostitutes and all the rest every time I left the house. But right next to that is a touristy spot. 2 blocks away, it's all the bright lights, and that's where I saw Paris Hilton walking through an alleyway, which, by the way, I knocked her hat off her head. I just thought it was funny. But speaking of the zombie thing, there's a type of heroin there called black tar heroin. And if you do it for a while, your skin literally takes on this really sickly greenish tint. And it's just the most disgusting thing, especially when people are on it and they're kind of like, and people, I'll get emotional like talking through it, but it's really one of the saddest things in our society right now.
And that just goes to show it's such a sick society. This is a book from, I don't remember when it's from. It's probably from the 60s because the guy died in the...
Oh, yeah, from...
Yeah, it's 1955. But this book is called The Sane Society. It's from Eric Fromm. He was somewhat part of the Frankfurt School. He's not great when it comes to... He's got the same flaws as the Frankfurt School, but he was a psychoanalyst by practice, and he provided a critique of the sick society that we have, and in terms of the values that we uphold and that sort of guide our everyday life, the consumerism and different forms of consumerism, because that drug addictions are a form of consumerist, unhelpful consumerist practices. Unlike some of the other ones, but they're still a crisis of a form of consumption. And he does a really good job in that book at teasing out from a psychological point of view how deeply sick the society that we have is, and how a socialist society would be a sane society. And I think that although I probably wouldn't recommend many people to read from because there's contradictions that we would like to avoid, read them if you want. But that angle of like, this is an irrational, sick society that makes no fucking sense and that produces sick people because it can profit from them and dehumanizes people systematically, right? It needs what Marx called the relative surplus population at all times. It's just, moral arguments ultimately are important. Remember that Daniel de Leon analogy of the ship. Scientific socialism is the body of the ship, and the moral arguments against capitalism are the sails. And really, in order to get the ship going, you need both.
That's very well said. I want to address Cobra Commander real quick. No, I was correct about it. I didn't misspeak. Brother Crocodile, however, is actually something really gross that I believe was developed in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. And it was opiates mixed with like horrible stuff like phosphorus, right? And it would literally eat away at people's flesh. And this was all they can get, and life got so bad that they were doing this. And their like skin, their flesh was falling away. It's just
what I remember hearing about it as a kid was it turns you into a crocodile because your skin turns like scaly and starts to peel off.
Exactly. It's really disgusting.
Dude, that shows the material conditions that people were in after the fall of the Soviet Union. a human rights disaster that was for everybody living in Russia and any of the other Soviet states that were apparently, colonized by the evil dictatorship of the Soviet Union. Yet once the Soviet Union fell, they fell into this absolute state of horrendous poverty.
Right. There's so many other sicknesses that are tied to that too, because just from like needles, right? The sharing of needles can, it's just not very hygienic. And one of the things that, I don't know if you can say this, but the socialist organization we were working with in undergrad, one of the things we would do is go out to bars at night and hand out clean needles, because it's often, people think that by condemning people that are in that space, you're doing them any good. You're not really. Like, it's through compassion that you can bring them out. And, sometimes that takes the contradictory form of having them ensure that if they're going to consume, at least they'll do it in a way that doesn't transfer diseases. And in the process of giving them that, you can tell them that you care about them, that you think that they can sober up, and that you're there for them. And that's often what people need the most, to know that there's someone there for them that cares for them and that can see them through the time that they're in.
For sure. Well, do you guys have anything else you want to hit? I know we're getting pretty late.
Yeah.
Super late for Noah. Thanks for staying up with us, Noah.
Any
I don't
recommendation?
remember the last time I was up this late. It's been years.
Noah's actually a clone. We have it's not the real Noah that we have up here, but
I wish we could clone ourselves.
It's actually a robot.
Yes. Thank you.
The actual Noah is sleeping. He programmed me earlier.
Thank you, Anthony Gurrieri. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He says he loves the stream and donated $2. Thank you so very much.
Thank you to Lemonheads too. We forgot to hit that. Zorro.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Trump fans are investing in Iraqi dinar currency.
Interesting.
While the dollar's plummeting, I've seen estimates that by 2030, only 30% of international trade is going to be handled in the dollar. So that's going to take away one of the most important toolboxes in empire's accessibility, which is sanctions, right? Because it's global dollar hegemony, which allows these international financial institutions to control the dollar supply of different countries and to be so effective in sanctioning people. And that's all crumbling now, and it's crumbling at a very fast rate. So that's very good.
Yeah.
So not to harp on it, but that means organize right now, not next week, right now.
Literally right now, go outside your house.
Yeah.
Go to
the Communist Party website, join whatever. Yeah, right now, this minute.
I wanted to just add that $8 is it.
Let's start an organization together.
Yes,
we're gonna buy a shock bracelet for Noah, and when he interrupts, we'll shock him remotely. He'll be like, "What the fuck was that?"
I'm gonna. When we buy Noah a mic or a camera, I'm just gonna have a taser attached to it. What was I don't even remember. Oh, the U.S. also likes to manipulate oil production. So like when Venezuela was exporting a lot of oil, they went to the other OPEC countries and said, increase production of oil so Venezuela's oil commodities are cheaper and they can't make as much money off it, and you do socialism. So they won't have that same power without the petrodollar either.
Yep.
Another tune. Oh yeah, send it over, Sam. For comfort for the subject of addiction. The last tune was awesome.
Yeah.
We were actually talking about that for a while after the stream, like how when you listen to a song while you're doing something that you enjoy doing, it creates a sort of emotional attachment to that song where it takes you back to that. And we've had that now with a few of the songs that we played on our stream because, we associate it with the stream at that point, which is pretty cool. And I think it's a good way to build community here and, share art and culture with the audience, which we want to do. And we're limited from doing because of the intellectual property laws that capitalism puts on us. But, dude, I got to show you guys this too. I figured out what happened with TYT. they made a video about Russia, and Vaush called them tankies. So people are saying, or this tweet says, when you're to the right of the fucking Young Turks, so you call them tankies. Highly embarrassing and deeply unserious. He called them the Young Tankies. So
Jesus Christ, that guy is possibly the biggest scumbag I've ever come across.
yes.
I've been alive a long time. I can't think of a bigger scumbag. I really can't.
He's truly the antithesis of everything we stand for here at Midwestern Marx.
Yeah, it
is
really
about.
is.
By the way, if you want like the best commercial for having a heroin addiction, it's Noah. He looks like he's my age, and he's like twice as old as me, and he looks super young. You should just start telling people, you want to look young, get addicted to heroin.
It reverse ages you.
After a notable point, you go past zombie and you actually go back to being like 16. You look so young. It's insane.
This Benjamin Button disease.
My son has these comic books him and his friends do, and one of them, like, it's been an ongoing thing for years, called The Adventures of Joey Longchin. There's a guy with a big long chin, right? But he has what he calls reverse Benjamin Button's disease. Maybe it's just normal, I guess.
Oh man.
All right. Any other points of discussion you guys want to bring up?
We have let's see. So we have
next week.
Tuesday. Yeah, Tuesday. We have the technically the first class, because the last one was like an intro class. But do you want to tell us a little bit about that, Noah, before we play the outro song?
Yeah, and this one I'm gonna get to be able to live stream, so that'll be good. We are doing our first ever in a very long running part of the Institute, we hope, Marxism school. And so we're going to be having different courses and different subjects, all kinds of great stuff. This one is called The Basics of Marxism, and it brings people to the Marxist worldview. By the end of the course, we have, I think, about 25, 30 students. By the end of the course, everyone should be able to do their own Marxist analysis rather than just, memorizing conclusions, which is how we're taught to think. It's every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern. And then, do you want to tell them about the exciting thing we got going on the day after, Carlos?
Oh, yes. And then the day after, Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time, we're going to be talking to Dr. Anthony Montero again, man. The interview we had with him last time was so enriching. Eddie has mentioned it a few times that it's one of the most transformative and learning interviews that he's done, and I share the sentiment. Montero's awesome, and we'll be talking about Paul Robeson. We just had the 125th anniversary of his birth last week. He's literally he's got to be put on the currency when socialism gets here. And yes, anarchists, we are going to have money after the revolution. So get those dreams about abolishing money out of here from day one. But he's just such a renaissance man, an amazing football star, amazing theater performer, amazing singer, literally world known, like the biggest star that existed in his various fields. Knew like 23 languages, and was a communist militant and just a brilliant human being with as good a character as you can possibly have when you're a part of our species. So he's not remembered because of the twin evils, as Winston called them, of racism and communism, anti-communism. But he is, a star as any out there. And his 125th anniversary just passed. The Free School celebrated it in Chicago, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Robeson's legacy. We're going to dig a little deeper into Du Bois, perhaps go beyond just Black Reconstruction, which was the focus point last time. And we hope to talk about some contemporary issues, ask Dr. Montero about RFK Jr., ask him about Norman Finkelstein, who he's had some very interesting criticisms of. So it's going to be a very, very enjoyable conversation. Make sure to tune in Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern.
For sure. If Vaush is the antithesis of Midwestern Marx, Paul Robeson is everything that we want to be.
Yeah.
Damn straight.
That whole line of Du Bois, Robeson, Winnie, Henry Winston, William Patterson, Gus Hall, William Z. Foster, all those people, man, there are heroes in this country. I'm okay, so it's
James
their leaders,
Baldwin.
James
I got to
Baldwin.
throw him in there because Montero introduced me to him, and like his essays are so good, dude. They're so good.
Take Me to the River is so very good. Yeah.
It's
I mean,
like
we could go-
otherworldly. Like you read it, and you're like, I could never, if I sat down for 100 hours or 100 days straight and tried to write something like this, I couldn't even fucking come close.
I think actually Montero, in our interview with him, which by the way I absolutely agree, was fantastic. And we love everyone at the preschool. There's a reason the institute and the preschool get along so well. But in that he said that Baldwin may be the greatest essayist in the English language. And I don't think I could argue with that. I don't.
Yeah, just intuitively brilliant. But yeah, perhaps one of the things we can watch next segment is that HUOC, Robeson at HUOC. Such a great speech, and it's just so in contradiction with the national nihilism that we have in large chunks of the left today. So that's something that I don't know if we've reacted to it in the past, but it's an amazing defense.
I've done TikToks about it, but never reacted. So I'm adding it to our list of things to react to right now.
Perfect.
Yeah, unless you guys have anything else to add, then I'll play this song from Sam Dixon. We can head out. Thank you so much to all the super chatters, all the viewers, all the mods, everybody who interacted with the chat in general. Make sure to like the stream, share it if you haven't. And yeah, thank you. Any parting words, guys?
Keep fighting.
Solidarity.
Solidarity, everyone.
When I was young, younger than before, never saw the truth hanging from the door. And now I'm older, see it face to face. And now I'm older, gotta get up, gotta clean up. When I'm greener than it, where the flowers grow and the sun shines still. And now I'm darker than the deepest sea. Just hand me down, give me a place to be. And I was strong, strong as the sun. Thought I'd see when the day's done. And now I'm weaker than the palest blue. Oh, so weak.